Good morning and welcome everyone to the sixth meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee in 2021. We've received apologies for this morning from Beatrice Wishart, MSP. Our first agenda item this morning is evidence on the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Can I welcome to the meeting our first panel this morning, Paul Sheeran, the Chief Executive Officer of Scottish Engineering, and Martin Reid, the Director of Scotland and Northern Ireland with the Road Haulage Association. Can I thank you both for joining us today, gentlemen. We'll move straight to questions. I'll ask the first question. We both heard from you in the run-up to the agreement being struck, and you raised a number of concerns at that point, and I wondered whether you could give us a feel for where we are now, 2 months into the agreement. I don't know if Mr. Sheeran wants to start.
Sorry, just about a time that the mute button working. Yeah, I'd be glad to do that. The experience, unfortunately, since we actually reached the end of the transition agreement, the transition period has not been a good one. I sent a paper which no doubt you have circulated, and I'd like to update on that because we have now closed that survey, and it doesn't make good reading. So of our surveyed members, we had over 100 responses to that survey, and only one in 4 of the companies reported no impact due to the end of the transition period. And unfortunately, that just reflects the companies that are in manufacturing engineering who don't export at all, which suggests that almost every exporter in the manufacturing engineering space is suffering detriment as a result of the end of the transition period and the move to the new processes that we have. Companies experiencing detriment due to the availability. So this availability of logistics has been a huge impact on inbound and outbound shipments. So 45% of companies experiencing that. 50% experiencing detriment due to increased cost of logistics capacity because the additional administration and delays have taken capacity out of the system. Experiencing detriment due to the additional administration costs relating to customs and logistic processes. 56% of companies say that that's what they're experiencing. And so even those who are not exporting are experiencing that in their import processes. And just to add a little comment to that, one of the comments that we got was from a company that stated that they had a 10-fold increase in their administration costs associated with the logistics processes post-Brexit. And finally, experiencing a detriment due to the additional admin costs was 42%. Due to post-Brexit processes. I mentioned that 1 in 4 companies only are experiencing no impact. The Pareto of this most significant impact to companies, the highest is export documentation processes, just behind that is import documentation processes, and then country of origin evaluation resulting tariff implications is the close third behind those. So I'm afraid some significant impacts across. And just to say, the biggest concern for companies you might hear from all of that is that they are experiencing additional costs. That's not what worries them the most. The thing that worries them the most is that delivering to their customers right now, they are late. They are late because parts coming in are late, and so they cannot build quickly enough. They have a capacity constraint from that. And then when they go to book goods out to get them on transport out, they're either delayed because of the lack of capacity in logistics, or they're delayed through the processes. But ultimately that means their customer receives their goods late. And their question in their mind is how long are they going to look at that and say, is this worth the hassle of working with a company based in the UK where we can go somewhere else where those barriers are not in place.
Right. Yeah, that is very worrying. And I should have said at the outset, thank you very much for the paper that you circulated, which was very useful for updating us on some of the statistics in that paper. Do you have any actual illustrations of how this works for particular companies on the ground?
So, illustrations, so examples. So what this has washed over is that there this the lack of capacity and this additional kind of burden means that for inbound companies, some of our largest companies, 2 weeks ago, maybe it's 3 weeks ago now, had to send home 200 staff from their factory because they didn't have enough parts for them to build with. And that same company, who is one of the larger manufacturers in Scotland, has had to air freight in 7 chartered aircraft at a cost of £1.75 million to try and keep their supply chain of parts going, to try and keep up with their commitments to customers.
Right, that's worrying. Thank you very much. Mr. Reid, when we spoke to you before, I think it was last November, your big concern was the licences, which you feared that there wouldn't be enough of, and the issue of cabotage. I understand that both those things were addressed in the agreement, but your paper suggests you've got enormous difficulties. I wonder if you could maybe address those two things.
Yes, just for clarification purposes, it wasn't me that was on it last time. Unfortunately, at the time that I had COVID, so it was one of our directors from to do that. So thank you very much to convener and also to the committee for today. It's a very similar picture to the one you've just heard. The concerns that we had pre-Brexit were largely around the lack of preparation time that businesses had to see what the requirements were. And unfortunately, come the 1st of January, then any mistakes that were going to be made or any system errors that were going to be made were happening in real time, which has a knock-on effect throughout the supply chain. Effectively, we had a supply chain from top to bottom that was having to relearn how to do the basics in moving goods. And it's taken quite some time even to get the most simplest of steps in place. So I would echo what your other speaker has said. It's been a difficult time for logistics. We have, or the systems that we've inherited, the new way of working, have been largely set up around one product being picked up from one site and moving to one venue through one medium of transport. And unfortunately for Scotland, very few types of goods actually move in that way. And so the main issue that we've faced is around what's called the groupage model, and seafood in particular were highlighted as one of the main sufferers in that area. But it's right across the board, because as a nation we're quite small, and a lot of our manufacturing is not necessarily of a massive scale. So what happens there is that there are multiple pickups from multiple sites that get consolidated in one load and then moved on. But unfortunately, the systems that have been put in place do not allow that to happen. Last week I was on the Food Sector Resilience Group, where the representatives from many different areas, and one quote that came out to me, that stood out to me, was that one of the manufacturers' bodies had said, "One load getting through is newsworthy," and that was only last week. So it kind of highlights the issues that we've got with a supply chain that is still really trying to find its feet. There are some issues that will definitely be teething issues that will ease as time goes on, but there are some fundamentals that we need help with, and the groupage model is certainly one of those. There have been trials, and as I said, I believe this week, even the difference 1 week makes, that some movements have been happening, but it's nowhere near the volumes that we were used to pre-Brexit, and I think there'll be a long while before we can get to that stage again.
By groupage, you mean a truck that carries several different types of loads from different exporters, and that's something that has been raised with us by the food industry that we have had in front of the committee already. So what you're saying is that Scottish exporters rely on that groupage more than perhaps the rest of the UK. And so, although everybody's got huge problems, we have got particular problems in Scotland.
I wouldn't say that we have particular problems over the rest of the UK around the groupage model, because it's the same for everybody. But what I would say is peculiar to Scotland. I mean, in the paper that I sent, I outlined the amount of international operators licences that we have in relation to the rest of the UK, and it's partly because we're so far away from the ports, I think, the major ports. But what we do move is time critical and high value, and so the groupage model that the Scottish logistics are looking at, as I said, tends to be so time critical, and it's a just-in-time industry that we operate anyway, or did operate. And so the delay, any cost of delay to those time-sensitive loads is absolutely critical, and it's right the way through supply chain. So it's not just the end point that's delayed; it's a knock-on all the way through to the start point.
I should have said thank you very much also for the paper, the very useful paper that you circulated to us. And if I can just quote from that, in your survey, you talked about in week 3 of January, compared to a normal pre-Brexit week, full loads to Europe were down by 68%. Loaded in others showed a reduction of 51%. Those are enormous figures.
Yeah, that was a survey done to our international group of hauliers. We have a separate subsets of membership in the international hauliers, which are predominantly made up of southeast, but not exclusively. They're all over. But what we were finding is that two things. Firstly, the complications that were involved in moving goods through the Dover Straits, the short straits, were making it so problematic, and that a lot of time critical goods would not move to start off with, because the risk to losing the entire load was too great. We were also finding that the European hauliers who come in and bring the goods into the UK would rather go back empty than bring our goods out because of the potential for time delays. If you're a European haulier, then would you be keen on sending your guys into Britain knowing that they may not get back within 28, 48 hours to do the next load? So it's a lot of them have been taking a risk-averse approach to that. So that was the survey from our own members, but even looking at the numbers that are coming out from the French side, they're still saying that between 50 and 55% are returning to Europe empty.
Right, okay, thank you very much. That is worrying. Now, in response to the trade movement figures which you published, the UK government took out quite an unusual step in that they issued a statement basically disputing your evidence. In their statement, they said that there were no queues at the short straits, disruption at the border has been minimal, and they challenged some of your figures. For example, you said that on the question of how many lorries were returning to the EU empty, the point that you've just raised, they said this does not reflect the data from our French counterparts, which puts the figure closer to 50%. How do you feel about that UK government rebuttal?
I guess it was a fairly rare step for the government to take. I think there's been frustrations on both sides. I guess I know nobody's suggesting that the UK government are not trying to help here or trying to solve the issues, but I guess part of it would be that our chief executive has spent a lot of time with Mr. Gove and his associates, and trying to point out the issues that the industry has been facing. And I guess perhaps there's been a level of frustration on both sides there. But at the end of the day, we have to report what our members are saying. That's who we fight for, essentially, and there's been very few businesses. Some businesses have thrived, and as I said, those who perhaps move one type of good from one venue, and they can take it straight through with limited hassle. But for others, particularly, as I said, who rely on consolidated loads, etc., it's been an incredibly difficult time. Now, if you balance that with the double whammy that came with COVID, and last year businesses losing money because of lockdowns, etc., then there's no family silver sitting in the background to bail the companies out. The other gentleman who was speaking, Mr. Sheeran, mentioned about the on-cost to businesses for compliance with the new systems. And our sector is feeling that acutely. I mentioned in my paper that there's a lack of qualified customs agents, again something that the government deny, but we have seen that is definitely the case, and so hauliers are now having to become their own customs clerks, so they're having to take on admin people, train them up on systems that are still in their infancy and we're still learning, in order to cope with the additional paperwork that's required. As I said, nobody's saying that it's an easy time for the government, but it's not an easy time for anybody in this current environment.
Yeah. But you're being quite polite about the government. To go back to their paper, they basically said that in the first week of February, outbound and inbound flows across UK ports were close to normal. Is that right or wrong?
I think that one of the issues that we're facing is that for some reason the government are talking about flow, essentially, the amount of trucks or lack of queues as a metric. The bottom line is that we've got so many stranded goods that should be in the supply chain that are not in the supply chain just now. And so, no, we would not necessarily agree, coming from our members, that traffic flows are normal. We're not seeing that. But at the other side of the coin is that traffic flows may be normal, but depending on who you speak to, even if you take the government side of things, 55% are returning empty, then that's not normal.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful, Mr. Reid. I'll now move on to questions from the Deputy Convener, Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Can I first ask Paul Sheeran some questions? Paul, you've set out the challenges that are with the supply chain and the increased costs and the risk it is to reputational damage for the businesses you represent. At the moment, the importing system isn't fully operational. That will come in towards March, April. What concerns do you have? What impact do you think that will have? And how are your businesses trying to prepare for are they aware of what the changes are actually going to be, and how are they preparing for them?
So I suppose the honest answer with that is I wouldn't profess to be an expert enough to know what that is going to be. What I would say is this: so we have a weekly call among the four nations. So ourselves, Make UK, who predominantly have membership in England, EEF Wales, and Manufacturing Northern Ireland, and our colleague from Manufacturing Northern Ireland, who I believe are under those conditions right now, gave us a heads up to say, watch out, because if you're looking at Northern Ireland and wondering why we seem to be having it even tougher than you, it's because this, and it's coming for you in the time frame that you mentioned. So I haven't had a chance to dig into that with the staff here to understand why that is and what that's going to do to impact us. It's been hard enough to keep up with the level of questions and support we've been trying to give to members just now, but that was a comment made to me 2 days ago, and I need to get my understanding of that. But it's a deep concern because we haven't climbed out of the issues that, I'll be honest, I mean, the UK government refer to them as teething problems. I hope they're right, but I'm concerned that there needs to be more than hope in order to change things from where they are now.
And at the start of this, before the new year, the government had the slogan of "Are you ready?" or "Get ready for Brexit" type thing. It is quite concerning. I don't think it's your responsibility to try and work out what the import changes might be. But do you feel the government are giving enough support to provide businesses with understanding? of what is likely to be happening when we get round to March and April?
Well, I mean, that's a very fair point, and remember that there was a whole raft of these that were agreed, 6 days before the year end, and the and we would say, characterise, we were concerned that there were, a number of companies who weren't as prepared as they could have been, but they were definitely in the minority. What's been really interesting in the phone call since the 1st of January is the number of companies who I would have said were really well prepared, who put a lot of effort and risk assessment in understanding it, who said, oops, we found this, we found that, things that we thought were going to be like that. Go back to the point that Martin made about groupages. So groupages where yours is one of, say, 20 other exporters' parts on the truck. We had one company who said that their goods are held up for 3.5 weeks going out, and they were held up because one out of the 20 on the truck was deemed to have incorrect paperwork. It took a week for the response to come up back and say, in fact, the paperwork was correct, and it had shown an anomaly in the new software system, and then it took another 2.5 weeks for those goods to get moving. And just to underline that point, one of our big concerns here is that from a public point of view, there are no queues at the ports, there are no queues on the motorways. These truck parts in Kent aren't full. And I'll repeat a phrase which one of my members said to us, which is that's the reason for that, Paul, is because the queues at the back door of all these factories, the way that this has impacted, and Martin referred to that as companies being risk averse to take on goods that might have their asset tied up, then can't move something elsewhere. That's what's causing the queues at the back door of factories. So it's not visible. So it looks like we haven't had the impact that we have. Well, I'm sorry to say we have. I quoted those figures earlier. More than 50% of companies saying that they've had significant detriment from this situation, and that is the reality of where we are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can I move on to road haulage? Do you have in the last answer to the convener, you talked about the difference between what might be teething problems and what might be more fundamental, longer term issues. Could you maybe say a bit more about what you think the longer term, where the difference between the two is, what could be resolvable, and where you think there's just some fundamental issues that are more challenging to resolve?
Additional paperwork that's required, whether that be electronic or physical, then people will get used to that. I mean, that'll take time. We have to remember that the final iteration of the border operating model came in like 5 hours before, we actually, the Brexit period ended on the 1st of January. And so there will inevitably be teething problems when people find out the system and what is required. There are still numerous mistakes going on, as Paul pointed out, in terms of the paperwork. And when we look at something like groupage, then that does one mistake on one of the consignments stops the whole load, and that's a massive. People will learn the paperwork side of things as time goes on. What is systemic is, as I pointed out before, the requirements for moving using the groupage model to move. So either we can find some systemic solution for moving consolidated loads, or else we need to relearn how to move goods. And for an entire supply chain to learn or to find another way to move goods out with what we have been doing for a number of years is a systemic problem, and that's not something that's going to be a teething problem. So that's one of the major issues there. The other one, as again Paul alluded to, is the additional cost and burden that's placed on anybody that's involved in the supply chain. An example that we were given the other day is goods moving to Northern Ireland, and at the outset when the TSS was set up, rightly or wrongly, the inference was that you would only need to fill in a supplementary declaration for goods that were at risk of going to Europe via Northern Ireland. But it turns out that you need to do that for all goods moving to Northern Ireland. Now, a supplementary declaration will take with a good headwind behind you, in an ideal world, it'll take you about 40 minutes to do that. But when you think some of the companies are moving 80 to 100 consignments per day, then basic maths, that means they need to take on 8 or 9 new members of staff to cover the paperwork for what they did before without any difficulty. So if you're having to take on 8 or 9 additional staff and there is no extra money coming in from your processes, then that's a big hit on your business. And that's one of the ways that I would illustrate this, if you like, is that the big supermarkets wrote to the Prime Minister at early January that they would struggle to get their houses in order before the 1st of April, when the period of grace finishes. Now, if companies that size, with their turnover and their resource, are struggling to make it for the 1st of April, our industry and industries like Paul's had to have it ready, or try and be ready, for the 1st of January. And many of the businesses are certainly not of the scale of the big supermarkets or that. So it's a difficult thing for everybody to be dropped into. And yeah, I don't know what more I can add to that, but these are that's not teething problems. These are systemic issues that need to be resolved, and particularly around how we're moving goods that are animal or plant-based origin, where you need SPS checks and you need vet checks, etc., etc. This is all delay. This is all new, and it's some will be teething problems, but other things, the level of goods that we move means that we need help with this. Basically, we need easements. We need the government, the UK government, to keep dialogue going with the EU and try and find common ground that would at least let the backlog of goods that are not in the supply chain just now, that are being stymied at the back door, as Paul rightly says, to flow through.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I know other members wish to come in, so I'll conclude there.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Now, we have a number of members indicating that they wish to ask supplementaries, but given the time constraints and the constraints of the virtual meeting, I wouldn't be able to take them all in and make sure everybody got their main questions. So I'll come to the members in due course. I'll bring in Jamie Halcrow-Johnson next.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to the panel. The question I'd like to ask around some of the paperwork issues that we've had highlighted by other groups during our evidence sessions and in other committees actually that I sit on. I just wanted to know, I mean, the paperwork that you need to provide for EU exports now, which obviously has increased considerably, how is that different in terms of more or less about the same to the paperwork required for non-EU exports, i.e. to the rest of the world? And also, can I also just ask, is there, we've talked obviously about some of the problems with that and the additional costs. Is there any support with either the cost or completing that paperwork that's been, I suppose, beneficial? I'm sorry, if I can maybe ask Paul that first and then Martin.
Thanks, Jamie. So I think, one of the things that would be fair to say is that those companies who are used to exporting outside of the European Union have probably been best placed to adapt. Although having said that, even for them, their issue has been the lack of readiness, the lack of tried and trusted in these new process. So, they had a process previously which was entirely smooth, and that's changed. Now, I suppose the bit that you can see behind that is, well, there's opportunity to fix that in there, and so that has to be where the focus goes. To give you another example, though, when we talked about this, it's not just about those companies and their actions of them getting things out, but it's also about companies getting goods in. So I want to quote one of the comments that we got from our members who contributed to the survey that you were circulated with, said as a company we're very familiar with export processes. The problem often lies with our customers sending us goods, as they're not used to working with these processes, resulting in inbound delays. So it's not just in the gift of the company who are managing their outbound processes, it's also from their suppliers across the European Union who are now having to wrestle with these processes, and so that's an additional impact from it.
Well, can I ask you on that point, because that's actually that's very interesting. Obviously, there's a dispensation at the moment which means that goods flowing into the UK flow more freely than goods going out. So when that dispensation or that agreement ends, do you see greater problems for UK companies that are importing for parts, as you say? But also, do you think that puts greater pressure perhaps on the European Union to ensure that there is real action to address some of the areas where there are blockages that they control? Because obviously they don't want their businesses to suffer and to lose out on trade within the UK if, for example, there are more barriers to trading into the UK once the dispensation ends.
So, I think I can only go on the advice which was given honestly by Manufacturing NI, which was we've got another headache coming down the road on top of the one that we've got just now. So yes, I'm deeply concerned about that. On your point, you're right. European exporters don't want to lose that business, and so they will do what you see across the UK just now, which is companies frantically scurrying to try and find ways to improve that so that they can get over the issues that they've got. My concern in that is the balance. The balance now is the reason why this is so important to UK companies to ensure that those customers of those in Europe don't walk away, is that those customers in Europe have the choice from what the largest free trade area in the world economically, and we're just one small supplier into that. In the UK, we're sitting in a position where, yes, you can bring it from there, you can bring it from somewhere else, but oftentimes those selections have been made because they're absolutely right for the product. So we're out of balance, and that is one of the impacts of the choice to leave the European Union. Is we don't have that balance because within the European Union the marketplace is much larger. You've got wider options. So it's kind of that Hobson's choice for companies in the UK. They need to fix this. Where my concern on the other side is, they will not want to lose it within the European Union, but it's not of the same size and impact as it is for UK companies. And that's why we're having calls like this, the imperative to find ways to fix that and improve it.
Thanks for that, Paul. Martin, I don't know if you want to come in on any of those points, and I'll move to my next question.
I think Paul is spot on with that. We already know of European businesses that are basically staying until, at least temporarily, some permanently, saying it's just too difficult to do business with the UK just now. So they're sitting on their hands when it comes to that. One of the other issues, again, I think that was touched on earlier on, is that delays for us moving goods into Europe. If it becomes too problematic, then they look elsewhere for that supplier. And so, that is a real concern. But at the minute, nobody is benefiting from this, or certainly when the period of easements end in April and in July, then they will be faced with the same issues that we have been faced since the 1st of January. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be helpful to go down the them and us route here. What we're talking about is not politics. We're talking about trade, and at the end of the day, we need to make sure that what we had before was relatively seamless. We're not going to get that. So what we have to try and do is to make it as seamless as possible within the new constraints and the new frameworks, and not make more barriers than we already have.
Yeah, thanks for that, Martin. I mean, I would agree, and that's the evidence that's come up from other sessions that there's a problem now. There's potentially a problem coming up from the import side, but we don't want to be waiting to get that resolved. Although it might perhaps put pressure for action from both sides. The next kind of question, or my final question, was going to be around, I suppose, the where some of that easement might happen or that improvement might happen. we've heard from the seafood sector issues around when they get to Calais or other external customs areas, when they're trying to export or import into other countries, that there's some cases of inexperienced staff, or even some officials that are being overly technical, or even sometimes just wrong with how they judge kind of paperwork needed to be, and that's causing blockages. Is that something that you've seen within your experiences as well? Whereas, I say, it's not necessarily a Scottish or a UK issue. It is that once the goods have left the UK and are going into the EU, that there are barriers there. What can be done from that, and what is your general kind of experience of how goods are being treated once they've left the UK?
I think there's been a period of learning from all sides. At yesterday's Food Sector Resilience Group, we were hearing from it was the salmon producers actually saying that one of the loads that they got through yesterday was delayed for a substantial amount of hours because 20-page document on page 2 didn't have one box ticked that should have been ticked. And it's that level of bureaucracy that's causing the problems, where it could be a perfectly innocent mistake that is delaying the entire load. I was speaking recently to a company in Aberdeen who they moved bacon not just to Northern Ireland but also to the UK, the Europe, and they were saying that some of their customers and clients that they have in Gibraltar have got together and are chartering a ship to move goods directly from the UK to Gibraltar to not get involved with transit through Europe. So, as I said in my previous thing, is that this is affecting everybody, and it will definitely get worse when the period of easement finishes and we start doing inbound checks as well, because I hope that the government are not basically waiting so that Europe has the pain that we've gone through. I hope that's not the case. But I listened to James Withers giving evidence from Scotland Food and Drink a couple of weeks ago there, and he quoted a phrase that really stuck with me, and he was saying that even large exporters or large companies that have exporting in their DNA have struggled with what's happened since the 1st of January. So that will be the same throughout Europe. These big companies, that even the ones that think they have a handle on everything, will be faced with surprises that will delay and add cost.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add something to that, because I think it's always useful to hear from companies, and I think it's relevant to your question, Jamie. So one company told us export documentation is our biggest issue. We now experience challenges where individual countries within Europe are interpreting requirements differently. So we'd ask the UK government work with the EU to get member companies to understand new regulations consistently. And I suppose the point I would add about that is it comes back to what could be done to help. I look at that comment and it feels exactly like the phone calls that we receive here, on a daily basis. I think the UK government has done their very best to put up digital resources. But the fact is most of the phone calls we get are from people who've read the guidance and say, I don't understand, I've interpreted it this way, is that right? And more importantly than that is there's nobody there that they can phone. If there was one ask that came out of that to try and take some of that lack of clarity away, somewhere for companies to go to that they can actually ask the question. Because I know myself, I have become somewhat of an expert in going around the UK government's transition web portal for all the various pieces of guidance, and you can go down rabbit holes. And I say that with the best intentions, because people think the people who put that together have done their very best, but this is a hugely complex and hugely wide-varying subject. There are so many threads that can go in so many different directions, and so therefore I think it would be unfair to characterise that the European Union countries are interpreting requirements for anything other than the same reasons that companies here are interpreting requirements and going, one company's coming up with this read and this company's coming up with this read. And people like us are trying to understand and help that with them. But it's very, very difficult just now because the UK government departments are so pressed to actually speak to a human being and say, hey, what's the real deal with this? What's the correct interpretation of this finer point?
Just on that very quickly, Paul, I mean, when we speak to other kind of sectors, there's at least been an appreciation that, say, DEFRA have done their best and they've got a kind of hotline to help. But is your concern that there isn't that the same, kind of dedicated line available for other sectors that you deal with?
Yeah, can I say I don't doubt that there's a ton of people who are having a very, very difficult work-life time balance just now in supporting that, and we see, our very best efforts to put up useful information on the website. I say from my point of view, I've gone around it enough times that you get better at navigating it. It's just that point about remembering that companies who, for this is new for them, they export to the EU without thinking about it, and now they're learning it. I do think that some level of escalation where you can get to speak to a subject matter expert would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you both for your answers there.
Okay, thank you. Ross Greer next.
Thanks, Convener. I'd like to just start off by following up on the points that Martin made around this issue of hauliers based in mainland Europe bringing a load in but returning back to the mainland with their lorry empty because it's not worth the hassle, the cost, the potential delays, etc. Martin, yours is not an industry that I've got a huge amount of knowledge in, but I imagine that has a pretty significant impact on the financial viability of the haulage firms themselves. That's really taking quite a chunk off their margins. Could you maybe outline a bit what the financial impact on a haulage firm is if it's now only doing that kind of business one way? And is this putting haulage firms that are based in mainland Europe off trade with the UK? Are you picking up anything that these firms are beginning to look at trying to diversify their business, looking north and east elsewhere on mainland Europe and trying to avoid trade with the UK because of the financial impact of that?
Firstly, the way European hauliers are earning their money from coming into the UK is that they are paid a certain amount per kilometre. So prior to Brexit, it would be around €1.50 per kilometre. Post-Brexit, those who prepared to come to the UK are now charging between 10 and 11 euros per kilometre. So you're right, there is a financial impact to that, but those who are coming are mitigating it by upping the rates to a point where they're accommodating delays, where they would ordinarily get paid for the kilometre. They've compensated for that to be paid waiting time, essentially. So there are still a number of companies who don't want to come into the UK at all. The hassle. I mentioned earlier the company I was speaking to in Aberdeen that moved the bacon, and one of the byproducts of that is that they normally have a mountain of trimmings. I'm not an expert in the meat side of things, but they have trimmings which are normally bought by a German company. That German company have said they're no longer dealing with the UK, and so they now have a problem where they have so many tons of bacon trimmings that they would normally have an outlet for that they no longer do. So there are a number of companies who are sitting on their hands in terms of waiting probably till March time to decide whether they want to re-enter the market again. But there are some who have said, do you know what, the UK is not necessarily a massive part of our business model, and we can pick up 5-6% elsewhere for the market without having the hassle, just as Paul pointed out earlier on. So it's a very real issue, and it's as I said, it's not just hauliers. I've listened to a number of different businesses from different sectors saying that they have a concern in that area. So in part of the other answer, for road haulage, I wouldn't say that there's an awful lot of alternatives to using the short straights. Some of the other ferry crossings would do that, but in terms of looking for other markets, I have heard that particularly in the early days, and I'm sure you guys have as well, because you've had the seafood sector before you, that some of the fishing boats were looking to load in Denmark and move goods from there rather than moving it through the UK and onto Europe. But I can't comment too much on another sector and not my sphere, but I've certainly heard that that's been happening.
Thanks for that. I'd be interested in Paul's thoughts on what the impact of European hauliers simply avoiding the UK is going to be on UK exporters in manufacturing. Just before that, one brief follow-up to Martin on domestic hauliers on your folks. I'm imagining it's not a huge amount of fun at the moment if you are trying to regularly drive a lorry into mainland Europe and you're getting stuck for extended periods of time. That being said, because of the economic situation we're in, there's not a wide range of other economic opportunities for someone looking to make a career change. Are you seeing any workforce impact on UK haulage firms? Are some of your drivers looking elsewhere at other career options because it's just becoming too much of a hassle? Or are we in a situation where that's just not actually viable to try and make a career change at the moment?
Well, I guess there's two answers to this as well. Firstly, we as an industry suffer greatly from driver shortage. Now, depending again on who you're speaking to, the numbers vary between 35 and 50,000 as a shortage. We have an ageing population, and we have quite high barriers to entry for anybody that's looking for licence acquisition to start out. So a lot of hauliers are not running at capacity because of driver shortage anyway. The impact Brexit has had on drivers in particular, but also warehousing staff, etc., is basically, the free movement side of things. So there are no haulage-related or logistics-related jobs on the shortage occupation list for the MAC report, which is problematic for us because, like so many other industries in the UK, our industry has been underpinned by Eastern European workers for quite some time. So that's a problem. We've pushed for some time now to get drivers at the very least to be on the shortage occupation list, but so far that's fallen on deaf ears. But yeah, that's an ongoing issue. There was an issue pre-Brexit in terms of staff shortages within the industry. Brexit certainly hasn't helped it, but I wouldn't blame Brexit necessarily on the driver shortage situation. That's been happening for quite some time. The issue has come that the free movement that we had before for migratory workers and Europeans to come in and work has largely been taken away as well.
That's really useful, thanks. Just one final question I mentioned a minute ago to Paul around the impact on your sector on manufacturing, both in terms of importing parts but also exporting your products. Of what Martin's just said, if haulers in mainland Europe are looking to try and avoid the UK, I have no idea how much folk in your sector are using UK-based firms compared to Europe-based firms. What do you think the impact's going to be on the sector if there's a shortage of European firms who'd previously worked with your folks who are not willing to take those loads anymore because they're looking elsewhere?
So the first of those, there's two impacts, and the first of them is here now, and that's cost. What Martin talked about in terms of the cost per mile charge has resulted. So we're regularly being told of, so if you're a manufacturer who makes a couple of pallets worth of finished high value metal manufactured goods, a six-fold increase in the pallet rate to get that to your customer in Europe. So that's the first impact, and our member tell us, we don't ask about the cost right now. the cost is what it is, and we have to simply live with that and hope that this comes out of it before it does detriment damage to the business. But probably the bigger and more worrying one I mentioned before, which is the impact of delay. So all those trucks that are going back to Europe saying, I'm not taking the risk of moving goods back there, is the lack of capacity, and that's why we are late in getting goods to customers. And that's the one that leads to the risk that the customer sitting in Europe says, you know what, you're a good supplier, I like the quality and the cost, but you know what, it's not worth the hassle. I'm going to get a European supplier to provide these goods for us, and that's a massive risk, and that's probably their biggest concern. Costs they can live with for a while, not forever, but for a while. But the loss of customers, is the biggest concern.
Thank you. That's all from me, Convener.
Thank you very much. Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Mr. Reid, in your submission you've said that somewhere in the chain, somewhere isn't sure of what paperwork is required and is not confident enough to move the goods in fear of incurring the additional costs for delay. And you say that even major supermarkets are impacted, and they wrote to the Prime Minister to tell him they were not confident that they would have their processes ready by the 1st of April, despite their scale and resource. But the UK government has responded that all IT systems and infrastructure were ready in time and are operating effectively. Do you feel that that's correct, and that the IT systems and infrastructure are working correctly?
We obviously inherited, well, we didn't inherit, we had systems put upon us, and there was a period where there was uncertainty as to what systems spoke to others. You also had, obviously, the issue where you've got people who are using systems for the first time. There was no opportunity to test these, to play around with them, to get used to the systems beforehand. So the problems are magnified when you're trying to do these things in real time. The feedback that we've had, and I won't claim to be an expert in this, is that the TSS side of things for Northern Ireland is a bit clunky, and it's resource intensive. So the amount of detail and the amount of time it takes to do submissions takes some time. That's as I said, I wouldn't claim to be an expert in TSS, but that's what we've heard. In terms of the system side of things, the government obviously would have had to look at testing these beforehand, but nothing is as good as live testing, and so the teething problems that are within the systems will undoubtedly resolve themselves as they have been over time. But it's about the amount of time it's taken to do these declarations and the paperwork that's required, whether that be online or whether it be the paperwork that a driver is physically carrying with him in the truck. Paul's mentioned that pretty eloquently, but we've heard that submissions that ordinarily would take 20 minutes were at the start of January taking 5 to 6 hours. They might be down to 2 to 3 hours now. But all that comes with a cost, and all that comes with delay. And unfortunately, it's for our sector, it's the haulier that's taken the pain with that. And as I said, I know of a number of different companies that have said, right, we can take the pain just now. We'll sit on it, but we will look at maybe the end of March time and make a decision as to whether certain business practices are viable anymore or not.
Now, the next question I'm going to ask first to yourself, Mr. Reid, but then Mr. Shearer, I'd like him to comment as well, and it's about confidence. I always think business is a bit like football, in that you have to be confident in order to be successful. Both the Scottish and UK governments have for years tried to encourage and support exporting, but if you were a company now that was not actually involved in exporting, but previously had considered perhaps dipping your toe in the European market, how do you feel all this would impact upon your thought processes? And I say this from a practical point of view. In my constituency, I've got an employer that employs over 350 people and is a very significant manufacturer of steel products, and yet they would not consider, they've told me, exporting. So I'm just wondering, because of the long-term, I'm thinking the long-term implications for both haulage industry and manufacturing itself. So, Mr. Reid.
I would suggest that if anybody is looking to change their model, then the first thing they do is do cost-benefit analysis, and I would think that, or also about whether it's easy access into a new market. And I would suggest that at the minute, the barriers to entry are quite significant. I would go back to the point that, as I said, that stuck with me when James Withers was talking about it. If you've got major companies who, in their DNA, struggling just now, it would be very difficult for somebody from out with that background come in and make a success of it straight away without having a resource at the back of it. That would be my feeling.
Okay, Mr. Sheeran.
Yeah, I think your point about optimism is a good one. We've often said that it's often very clear why we go into an economic downturn, and there's usually a lever or some, in this case, currently, specifically coronavirus, but it's sometimes less clear that what happens with coming out. And so, yeah, there's no doubt that the Brexit transition end couldn't have come at a worse time, because I think, I'll say personally, we saw an upbeat kind of mood generally at the beginning of December. We saw companies appreciating the fact that vaccination programs were coming. There was a general pickup in business, and there was a more optimistic mood. The arrival of the new variant virus, in late December, was a real blow to that confidence. And then I think on top of that, the reality of what the Brexit impact has been a further blow, and I think that's really a concern, overall. Our optimism figure will be in our report that will be published a week tomorrow. We expect it to be negative. That's what the early indications of it look, but that'll be firmed up a bit more objectively, as I say, in a week's time.
Okay, thanks. And Mr. Sheeran, we heard already about how hauliers from Europe prepared to come over are upping their rates from €1.5 per kilometre to over 10 kilometre in some instances. Raw material costs are obviously very important for manufacturing, and I'm just wondering, you touched on costs earlier, but I'm just wondering what impact that could have on those input costs. And also, you said in July 2020, in a quote, an estimated 400 million extra customs declarations could average up to £13 billion per year additional cost to UK businesses. So could you talk to me about costs and about how you feel that viability of Scottish and UK companies are currently being impacted by this?
So the cost one, I think, I go back to that quote from that company, a tenfold increase in the administrative resource required to keep up with, and you can fast forward that to, and then add the administration charges every time you make such a declaration, and you can do the and see where they are. I think on the supply chain, there's no doubt that there's been reports of supply chain increases, and here I need to be fair. There's a fair part of that which is, so much of our manufacturing is based on steel prices, and there has been an increase in steel prices worldwide due to shutdowns of major facilities due to coronavirus, and that's a worldwide issue. So it becomes difficult to separate those two. So I'm a bit cautious to lump the two of them together. I think we need to be a bit more careful of that. I think there is a bit on both sides where both suppliers and customers are doing what they can to keep those costs down, because everybody's in that situation where they do not want to lose custom.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to always take into account that, not everything is due to Brexit. There's also a COVID impact, if we're going to be fair about how we assess this. But just one last thing I was going to ask you about, Mr. Sheeran, and that's about rules of origin. I'm just wondering how the rules of origin, how these are impacting upon the kind of issue in terms of paperwork and processing that we've talked about earlier, because obviously that's very important for Scotland, and it's one of the issues that we have to kind of try and get over at this current time.
So if there was an exam question that I prefer not to be asked about rules of origin, would probably it be, because it is really a complex area, and it's one that our members are struggling with the most. You might remember that I said it was a close third behind import documentation processes and export documentation. So some of the issues here are due to the complexity of supply chains. But let me try and remember if I get this correct. So a company who's bringing something in from outside the European Union, so they are importing it, but effectively that part then bounces and it's going to the European Union. So what happens now is you have a consideration that you pay the duties on it from wherever it's coming in the world on its way in. And unless now you do some additional complex process, when you move it to the European Union, because you declare its rule of origin as being substantially not within the UK, then it becomes due for duties again. So there's a double hit. And when you think about where that comes to, the first hit, the duty comes directly to the importer in the UK. But then when they move that to their customer gets an additional cost, which effectively makes the part more expensive. So now you're into a situation where the importer, so the UK business, has to either consider the inbound processing relief, IPR, or they need to go to the expense of setting up a customs duty warehouse so that they can hold the parts duty free and then pass them on, and then subsequently pass on the saving that they made on the inbound duty onto their customer, so that to their customer the price looks overall the same. So now working out which of those can be applied, as in how much substantive processing goes to the part, that's just another whole ice cream headache that the manufacturers have to work out that they didn't have to work out before. So you can see that in your burden and administration. And some of the calls are pretty close. So for instance, if you're taking a part in and and combining it into something, and it becomes a 51% origin in the UK manufacturer, we're okay. What happens when the exchange rate fluctuates and it goes to 49%? You change, you flip-flop backward and forward. So these are some of the complexities that are within that simply just didn't exist for these manufacturers before. And they all add to delay, and they can add to delay because errors can be made from that complexity, which cause some of the issues that we've heard about.
And with what I started with, that will again dissuade many companies from actually entering the export market in the first place, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, will it not?
Unfortunately, so so against our goal, which is for Scotland and UK as a whole to be a larger net exporter of manufactured goods, unfortunately that is off-putting for those companies.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much, Dean.
Thanks very much, convener, and good morning to Paul and Martin. Martin, in a previous answer, you said you're seeing some progress as people are getting used to the new system. I'd like to explore that in a bit more detail and get your sense of where you are seeing progress, and specifically what more can the UK government and the Scottish government do to help your sector and exports in general. And I'll start first with Martin and then turn to Paul with that question.
Okay, I guess the improvements are basically around the fact that people are starting to get used to what is required of them. I go back to my previous comments about things like groupage, where it's been an incredibly difficult process for anybody involved in that. But we are now seeing some groupage movements happening. Now, as I said, it's not anywhere near the volumes that we were previously used to or that we need moving forward. So in terms of what has been required or where we can get help, I think that, as other people who have been in front of this committee have said, that we need the UK government and the EU government to look at the potential for groupage and the amount of checks that are required on it, just to ease the flow. I noticed George Eustace I'd said the other week there that there's a proposal for SPS and vet checks, etc., some sort of agreement with Europe. Well, things like that would definitely help to reduce the admin burden and also the time it takes to move goods. But yeah, I would suggest that that's the priority, is to make sure that the dialogue between the UK government and the EU does not become a them and us, because at the end of the day, both sides would benefit from trade flow. So we need that dialogue to happen, particularly before we look at the additional requirements that are going to come in April and July.
Thanks very much, Martin. And how about you, Paul? What more could the sort of UK and Scottish governments do to help?
So echo Martin's comments. They're absolutely spot on, and they would be number one on the list. I think behind that, some additional training and support to customs agents to sort of smooth the flow of goods at the borders, and get through the learning curve as quickly as possible by supporting that, I think would be second. I think there's support and perhaps coordination, which I know is happening, but just to extend that support to logistics, supply and exporters, I think would be it. And then my last comment would be that it is a complex area. It's tricky to be able to find all the answers, just from the web portal. I think some constant clarification and updates to that may be aided with an escalation process where people can get a sort of direct advice and ruling where there is ambiguity. I think would be really helpful.
Thanks very much. I mean, what I take from that is that it's the kind of some of the understanding of the new border measures or the new trading measures sort of on the European side in terms of the free flow and making sure there's a sort of common understanding between the UK and the European nations in terms of what is required. I'm getting the sense that you're seeing enough help on the ground from the UK government and the Scottish government in terms of the number of vets, the number of officials helping with trade on the ground. So it's more that sort of bigger picture issue that you think need to be resolved? Or could more personnel help, if more vets or more custom officers were, put in logistics hubs across Scotland, would that type of thing help?
So what I can say is that, my concern is for understandable reasons, our sector, if ever there was going to be a choice in the prioritisation of who goes first and which gets priority, we're unlikely to be that. Metal manufactured goods and generally, the manufactured goods that the bulk of our members are making are not time sensitive, time limited. And I think we're all aware that nobody wanted to see and ever wants to see shortages in supermarket shelves. And there's a responsibility to us all for the movement of fresh goods or live goods that they have to get a priority. And so I think adding that capacity, I think, can only help. And for that, then it will push us up the list and make sure that not only these very essential ones are moving, but things down the line where, yes, they certainly won't go off because they've not got a sell-by date on them, but there is a sell-by date on the customer relationship, and I think that's the one that we would like to look after.
Thanks, Paul. And Mark,
I may have missed a bit there, so please follow up if that needs it.
No, Paul, that was a bang on in terms of your answer, and let me turn the question to Martin. And Martin, I guess to summarise, my question was, we can't at the moment change, how our European neighbours implement the new regulation. That's not something under our control for the time being. What is under the control of the Scottish Government and the UK Government is to help on the ground in terms of detailed logistical support and making sure the necessary officials are on the ground. So on that question, the things the UK Government and the Scottish Government can do, are you seeing enough literally on the ground practical help?
I think one of the issues that we face, and absolutely more vets would be great, and certainly more customs agents and also customs clerks. One of the issues that we face, and they'll face it on the other side of the water as well, is that the requirement for the amount qualified customs agents and experienced customs agents, it was impossible to recruit the levels that were needed with the levels of experience in such a short time. So even with the best will in the world, and as I said, with a good headwind behind you, if you're recruiting a new start who doesn't have the experience within the field, it takes so long to get them up to speed for even basic movements. And as we've pointed out, there are some really complex movements that are happening just now. We have to remember that there will be very few, if any, people that are working nowadays who were in these positions before we entered the EU. So that level of expertise just isn't there. And so for the people on the customs side, they're starting from scratch the same way. So we highlighted this a long time before the 1st of January, but it still holds true. I feel for these people because they're being dropped into a scenario where they probably haven't had the level of training that's required to do the complex movements that are now upon us all. But yeah, more customs agents, more customs clerks, and more vets would be a great help, definitely.
Okay, that's very helpful, Martin and Paul. Thanks again for your answers, and I'll pass back to the convener.
Thank you very much, Dean. And we're now bringing in Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, convener. I'm going to challenge the panel because we had the same statement from the Fishermen's Federation that this is not political. Well, all of it's political. Even the EU is political. The trade deals are political. I mean, yes, it's to do with the economy and business of the various nations. But these decisions are all political. And I also comment that, the thing that the lorry parks being empty, and the government saying, the UK government saying the lorry parks are empty, therefore all's well with the world, when you're telling me the lorries aren't bothering to go, is political. So I kind of park that because I find this very sad. All we're talking about is mitigating difficulties of leaving the EU. Now, the question I have is this, and I lay before you as this is my concern, is that the impact of all this dreadful stuff that's happening in the road haulage industry and other industries, I don't think the public are yet aware of it. COVID's covering it up a bit. I don't think they're yet aware of it. But you're telling me that when we get the same kind of regulations coming in from imports from Europe to Scotland and the rest of the UK, phased in, 1st of April, importing products of animal origin, where you must pre-notify the officials and have appropriate paperwork, and by the 1st of July, all goods will be liable for customs declaration of safety and security. You just like the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, think, well, the Europeans, when that starts to happen, the Europeans will start to be, it'll be more a level playing field. But I am going to put this to you. I have concerns this won't happen. So I'm asking you whether you share any of my concerns that the last thing the UK government wants is empty shelves in supermarkets. People aren't noticing the empty lorry parks. They're not noticing what's happening to your members, not noticing what happened to the 200 people that lost their jobs necessarily as part of this when the supply chain fell. They will notice almost immediately if supermarket shelves are open. Do you have concerns? I know this is hard, but do you have concerns that they will not be as tough on the imports from the EU here, especially on fresh goods, as they can't afford the political backlash if those shelves are empty?
Is that one for me, or is that for?
I mean, that's my concern. You know, I'm not interested in party political points. I'm interested in the concern that you're relying quite rightly on being a change once the imported goods start to hit all these regulations. My concern is that the UK government will not be as tough because you'll have empty supermarket shelves. And we know what happens when people panic when they say empty supermarket shelves.
Okay, whether the government are going to be as tough on it or not, I can't comment because I don't know the answer to that. But what I will say is that it's inevitable that there will be delays coming in when these new checks are in. So it's inevitable that there will be delays of goods getting in. It is that the government seem to be, as I mentioned, using queues at the ports as a metric. They always tend to use the food on the shelves as a metric, but we've already heard from Paul about the hidden cost of Brexit in terms of machinery parts, bits for factories, etc., things that perhaps are not sexy in the public view, but are a knock-on effect and affect employment. So I would, as I say, I can't hazard a guess as to what the UK government are going to do in terms of these checks, but the concern is that there will be inevitable issues. And as I said, you've heard from the Food and Drink Federation, you've heard from the seafood associations, and they will have their concerns. But I don't think anybody that's involved in manufacturing or logistics will be unaffected by the goods movements or restrictions on good movements for incoming goods later on. It'll affect every sector because it'll affect how ingredients for certain parts of food come in, and it will certainly affect anything of plant or food origin as well. So it's fairly inevitable that there will be difficulties come at the end of those easement periods.
So on that basis, now that notwithstanding 62% of the Scottish people voted Remain, so we are where we are, have to accept that now, for the time being anyway. Can I ask, what benefit have you seen from Brexit so far?
I don't think, other than for the logistics sector, I don't think anybody that, if we're talking specifically about exports and things, anybody that moves one solitary good from one solitary source using one solitary mode of transport going to one solitary venue will have had things reasonably easy. But as I pointed out, that's not how goods in the UK move. So nobody will have had any benefit from Brexit in terms of moving goods to Europe, because what we had was a seamless movements through ports and through most of Europe, and that is no longer the case. So that has certainly not helped the logistics sector move goods through Europe. There's been not really any tangible.
And the final point perhaps is to ask you, because nobody is in a silo, your road haulage, but of course you're road hauling for other manufacturing businesses, either supplying or transporting. What sort of concerns do you have with your expertise of the impact on all the other businesses and industries with which you deal, with which you serve as a profession? From what you're seeing, the difficulties, you must know, you've already given an explanation of 200 people being laid off in a business. Now that's a heck of a lot of people. So you know more than I do about this. So if you could perhaps enlighten me, and this is on the public record, so I'd like you to put your case so that the public begin to understand, not just when the supermarket shelves get empty, but what's happening right now, the hidden costs and losses.
Okay. If goods are not moving through the supply chain the way they should, then there's a knock-on effect for the end user, which will be the customer that goes into the shops to buy whatever. But you can trace it all the way back to whoever's manufacturing the goods. We have scenarios where, as I mentioned before, there are stranded goods that would normally be in the supply chain. So these are goods that could still be in the warehouses, could still be sitting at the ports, could be, as Paul mentioned, the effect is at the back door, so they might not be getting built yet because they haven't got the goods. They might, if we're talking about seafood, they might not actually have been caught, so which means that there's very little point putting the fishing boats out because there's nowhere to store them for their on journey to move forward. So it affects the entire supply chain. And as I said in my opening comments, we have an entire supply chain that's having to relearn how to do things. And that not any aspects of the supply chain that will go unaffected. So for the purposes of these conversations, most of it has been about export. But even those hauliers who are moving goods within the UK will be subject to delays at places where they would normally have seamless pickup, whether that be at ports, distribution centres. So yeah, all that adds time. There's a cost to time, and we are a low margin industry who operates under just-in-time principles. So every single delay has a knock-on effect in terms of cost to that business, whether the business absorbs it, whether they try to pass it on to their client. Most times the client will not pay for that, so they have to absorb it. And when you're looking at a business that runs at maybe 2 to 3% margin, every cost is an unwelcome one. You also have delays at ports where the trucks are not moving, so they're a cost because they're not moving. You've got drivers' time, whether that be sitting at a port or being on a delay or waiting for a delayed ferry or any of these things, or not getting a slot on a ferry, or because of the checks. You're paying for somebody's time while they're not productive. And all of that comes back to the business itself, and it's a cost that they are having to absorb. So if you add that to the additional admin burdens that are being required, the additional admin staff that's been taken on to complete the procedures, then it is a very, very difficult time for anybody that's in the supply chain that's looking to move goods throughout the UK.
Thank you. You've made that. It's very clear. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I suspect a great deal of the questioning has covered ground that I might have gone on, but I've got one particular area perhaps that we might briefly explore. One of my nieces, who manages a pharmacology lab, for a number of years lived in Norway and commuted daily into the EU because she worked in Sweden. And she found that border worked perfectly well for her. She crossed the border twice a day, and commercial traffic was able to freely move across that border in a way that seems to be a great deal more seamless than we're both experiencing currently and expecting to experience in future. So it's quite clear that countries that are independent and outside the EU can have fundamentally different relationships for trading purposes than the UK has chosen to make. And Switzerland too has a different model from Norway and a different model from the UK. Do you think, and I think this really is a matter for Martin Reid of the RHA, that we can get to a position similar to that exists at the land border between Norway and Sweden and between Switzerland and the EU? Or are we going to be stuck forever with a more onerous burden than either of these independent countries outside the EU have?
Well, thank you, Mr. Stevenson, for the compliment that I might be able to answer that question. I would suggest that it would go back to my original point about the importance of the dialogue between these nations. And we cannot afford to get into a them and us situation because everybody suffers if that's the case. So in order to get the borders flowing as quickly and as seamlessly as is humanly possible, then I don't think we're in a position to rule out anything. Our industry, along with Paul's and along with all the other industries that have been before this committee, I'm sure would all say the same, that the quicker access and egress through the customs procedures it benefits everybody. So if there was dialogue which enabled that, then I think it would be very welcome for UK business, for Scottish business and for European business, I would suggest too.
Thank you. I'll maybe now move to Paul Sheeran, while making the observation, of course, that the formal relationships that these small independent countries have with the EU is rather different from the hard Brexit that the UK government chose to have with the EU. But Paul Sheeran, I think there was some reference about the price of steel, and steel is an important Scandinavian product, and it moves across borders and is one of many things. Have you got any experience of that would lead you to have a comment on the borders that already exist around the EU with other countries, of which I've chosen to exemplify Norway and Switzerland?
So I'm going to go back to some previous experience, a former life where I was in a business that was exporting sunglasses around Europe, and just to say that we had a particular alert set up in our ERP, our computer system, for exports to Norway and Switzerland, and the reason we had that was because those goods had to be, our choice was to have them set aside for a third level check on all the paperwork and the way they were packaged to make sure they would go, because it was simply our largest headache, within Europe were those two countries, and that was with the kind of collaboration and kind of agreements that they had. I think manufacturers would give their left arm to get that level of hassle only just now, the Norway or Switzerland model. Unfortunately, it comes with a level of compromise closer to what the manufacturing engineering industry wanted in the first place, and that, unfortunately, that seems a long way away for the UK government.
Right, Convener, I think that really is all I wanted to ask. I think we heard that the UK government simply wasn't prepared to compromise the interests of industry in the way that Norway and Switzerland had, and I think that's me for now, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevenson. And we're just coming to the end of our evidence session. Our next evidence session is on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Martin Reid, we haven't gone in specifically to the Northern Ireland Protocol in this panel, but I just wondered if there was anything that you wanted to flag up with regards to the trade act between Cairnryan and Larne and Belfast. Are there any particular problems that you're noticing there, or any issues with the infrastructure?
Not specifically from Cairnryan to Belfast and Larne. That route seems to be operating pretty well. And that I would congratulate the government through Transport Scotland and the various other parties that were there about the setting up of Operation Overflow to try and ease any problems that were there at the turn of the year. So that seems to have worked really, really well, and so the government need to be, congratulated on that. So in terms of that particular trade route, we're not reporting many problems. The discussions that we have, Stena and P&O, issues of non-compliance, although they started off high as you would expect, we're dropping off in terms of people getting the paperwork, etc., right for the ports, and I've not heard anything to suggest that has changed any. So that particular trade route, I don't think has suffered as much as those from England and Wales, etc.
I guess that's a small chink of light in what has been a really rather depressing evidence session from both of you. Given, I think it's been really useful today because I think there's been a lot of emphasis on the food and drink industry and agriculture, and it's clearly suffering. But what you've showed us is that exporters are suffering right across the board. Every industry is suffering as a result of this. So in terms of taking away from our session today, what message would you like us to send the UK government as a committee?
For me, it would be just going back to that point about the continuing dialogue with the EU to try and make things easier for businesses on both sides, to try and mitigate some of the paperwork hassle and cost that's attached to look at these processes and see what is absolutely necessary and what is not necessary moving forward, because I'm sure some of them could be streamlined in order to help businesses. And also the fact that some of the things that people would traditionally look for as the metrics to raise concern, there are so many invisible effects that are happening within the supply chain that are not getting to the public eye. But these are things that need to be resolved. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Sheeran, is there any particular message you would like us to send?
Same one as Martin. I think if ever there was a time for looking for ways to agree on things and compromise to get some of the systemic issues that Martin particularly has talked about this morning out of the way, it's now, and I would say it needs to be done before it's too late.
Okay, well, thank you very much, both of you, Mr. Sheeran and Mr. Reid, for attending and for your evidence today, and also for your very helpful written evidence. The committee will shortly hear from a further panel of witnesses, and I'll suspend the meeting just for a few moments to allow those witnesses to join us. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone, to the meeting. We continue with agenda item 1 with further evidence on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And can I welcome the second panel to the meeting this morning? We have Mark Thompson, the Resilience and Community Safety Manager with Dumfries and Galloway Council, and also Mag Simpson, Head of Policy Scotland and North of England with Logistics UK. Can I thank our witnesses for attending today at short notice, and we really appreciate you being able to come. And so we'll move straight to questions from the panel. Can I open the questions by just asking you your experience of, we're now a couple of months in to Brexit, and how's things working from your point of view with crossing between Scotland and Northern Ireland? Mag Simpson, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much, and I should thank you for inviting me along to the committee. I'm hoping that you all received a copy of our post-Brexit transition survey, which was a survey we recently completed with our members between the 29th of January and the 4th of Feb. So that kind of has highlighted to us some of the key issues that are being faced by our members, and they kind of fall under three categories. So you've got the customs issues, sanitary and phytosanitary checks, and safety and security declarations, and they have clearly impacted the volumes of traffic that have been moving. More than half the respondents, I think it's important to say, are now saying that they're trading at normal values or indeed expect to go back to normal. On the flip side of that, however, there is a significant proportion, so around about 42% of those that responded, that do not expect to go back to normal levels. Now, I should say that this is the survey was asking members about movements between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and also clearly Great Britain to EU. But you can see that they've the detail is within that report. So overall, 62% of the respondents were starting 2021 with lower volumes than 2020, and 37.5% of those respondents were specifically talking about GB to NI movements. I think it's also important to say that some of those reductions in volumes were planned. So you'll have heard that there was some stockpiling went on, and in particular that happened in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, because hauliers and manufacturers were anticipating potential issues, and clearly it was going to take time for everybody to get their head around everything, all the new rules and regulations. But I do think it's important to point out that the number of vehicles going across to Ireland from specifically Stranraer, we have a regular meeting with Transport Scotland, and those figures are now reporting to be round about normal levels. That the specific route between Stranraer, or I should say Cairnryan and Larne, has not been as badly affected as perhaps some of the other routes. Maybe that would be a good place to start.
Okay, thanks very much. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. So it was a relatively soft landing come the 1st of January as a result of the very late deal being agreed, which mitigated maybe some of the worst risk we were facing from a no-deal Brexit. But notwithstanding that, during that first period we did see some disruption and some turn away of goods vehicles from ports due to not having paperwork. That really became more apparent after the end of the 7-day grace period between the 1st and 7th of January, when we were actually seeing not huge numbers, but significant enough numbers of lorry drivers getting turned away because their paperwork wasn't in order. Thankfully, that seems to have settled over the course of January, and numbers in that regard are quite low. We obviously, in conjunction with Transport Scotland, had the overflow site ready for either large-scale disruption or indeed as a temporary lorry park for goods drivers who had issues with their paperwork, and it was used by a number throughout January for that purpose to actually help resolve their issues. As things stand, obviously there is no checks on incoming goods on that route at this moment in time. And that's something that we'll see later in the year. And just to actually agree with Mags on the traffic, I think it was quite clear traffic was significantly down early in January, and that has recovered. But what was interesting, if you look at that, there is obviously a COVID impact as well, given that we're in a lockdown situation as well, so that perhaps masks some of the reality of the figure with the traffic. But interestingly, during January, movement of goods vehicles seems to have been up coming across from Ireland, very, very slightly, but there was a noticeable decrease in the movement of goods vehicles coming along the A75 heading towards the ferry ports as well, but that seems to have maybe corrected itself now.
Okay, can you just explain exactly what checks are taking place at Cairnryan, Mark? Where are they taking place and who's conducting them? And is every lorry checked?
My understanding, and Mags might be in a slightly better position given our familiarity with the industry, but GVMS paperwork really needs to be in order before they were the drivers will be allowed into the actual port itself. But there are no other checks in terms of any regulatory checks on our side of the border, and certainly there's no activity from any kind of UK national agencies as well. So it's basically to make sure there is paperwork in order before they actually make that crossing over to Ireland. But perhaps Mags can further elaborate on that for you.
Yeah, it's just to know where physically the checks take place, and
yeah, so
it's the port operator. Sorry, it's the port operators themselves that will check the paperwork. Did
you want to add to that, Mark?
Yeah, so it's as Mark was saying, the GVMS, so Goods Vehicle Movement Service, the truck operator has to register their vehicle, and it's a GMR number that is being done, that is being checked. That's being checked by the ferry company, but there are also a brief, what's the word I'm looking for? They look to check that the SPS seals are on the vehicle. So that's for the SPS checks when the consignment goes across to the Port of Northern Ireland, where then the vehicle would be opened and the SPS checks would be checked against the mandate for the vehicle, making sure that what is on the vehicle, it says precisely what's on the vehicle, and that these products are sealed if they're animal origin.
But thanks very much. And Mark, you mentioned quite rightly that in terms of goods coming in, we've got a breathing space until April and then July, when we'll have to conduct those checks. Can I ask from the Council's point of view what the pressure is for infrastructure to be put in place for that date? What have you been told about the infrastructure you need? What have you been told about your role and any costs involved for the Council?
So discussions are obviously ongoing with that. My understanding, or the Council's understanding, is that the designation process for an inland border control post is underway, but that has not yet completed. And there are a couple of challenges in there for us as a local authority. Historically, this has been a domestic crossing. There has been no need whatsoever for the local authority to have a Port Health Authority team. So we are in effect going to have to create and develop a Port Health Authority team from scratch. However, we do not yet have Port Health Authority status. And given how close we are to the 1st of April, that is a significant challenge, not only in terms of creating the framework for that, but from our recruitment process as well. That's hugely challenging. I mean, this is additional staff, and also major consideration, and we have made some representations, is the funding associated with that, because this will be a significant additional cost that will need to be addressed in the short term. Longer term, the costs associated with such a team could be recouped through the charges associated with SPS checks, both paperwork and physical checks. But in the short term, we are not able to actually do that, and we are aware that DEFRA, south of the border, in terms of Port Health authorities in England and Wales, made funding available to start that. We have had no confirmation of any funding available yet in Scotland. So we're awaiting further details on what funding support we will receive as a council to actually help implement this team. So a lot of uncertainty still, but the dates referred to are coming ever closer.
Yes, that is very worrying indeed. How many people do you recruit? What kind of jobs are they? Okay,
so this is partly where the challenge rises, and I will refer back to the fact that this has been a domestic crossing, and whilst there will have been some EU goods in there, there will obviously be a significant amount of Northern Ireland goods coming across there as well, with no checks, very little in the way of records coming across it on the nature of it. The size of the team will very much be predicated on the number of checks that will be required over the course of a working week, for example. However, we at this stage do not know, and I don't think any party really involved with this at this stage really know the split between qualifying and non-qualifying goods, i.e. goods that are of Northern Ireland origin and will not be subject to checks versus goods of EU origin that will be subject to checks. So until we have that proportion, and then we can look at the percentage checks that would be required in those goods, it's very, very difficult to build up a picture of the staffing levels required and the staffing profile in terms of 24/7 operation or a shorter period of operation, because as you'll know, the ferries operate right throughout the day, all week, and staff have to be ready to undertake these inspections as the goods come over as well. So yes, a number of challenges with regards to that.
And these staff, I assume a lot of them are quite specialised. They might be in areas of professions that are in short supply or will require training.
Yes, indeed. So environmental standards, trading standards officers, really, but they are very specialised. They're almost a niche within a niche, because the Port Health Authority role is different from the normal environmental standards and trading standards roles, and the significant amount of work that those teams undertake on a day-to-day basis across Scotland. So yes, they do need additional training over and above their kind of more general qualifications and experience that they actually have. And in addition to that, there will be veterinary staff that will be required as well. So this is quite a limited pool, professional pool to recruit from, and it's fair to say that ports right across the UK and in Ireland are obviously actively recruiting these skilled workers at this moment in time as well. So it is going to be a challenge to actually recruit. So there are short-term challenges and also longer-term challenges that we need to look at, and hopefully we can have systems in place longer-term to actually grow our own staff in that regard as well, to safeguard the future of that team.
Yeah, just correct me if I got this wrong, but you're competing with these other UK ports to recruit these highly specialised staff, and they've been given or give indications of money from the UK government, but you haven't yet.
Yes, obviously this whole aspect has devolved. Regulatory aspects are devolved. So really the funding streams for this may well have to come from Scotland rather than from UK. And I think the funding that was available to English and Welsh ports through DEFRA reflects that aspect as well. So we are working with colleagues in Scottish Government to get clarity on the routes for funding to actually support this. But you're right, there are challenges, and there will be challenges in staff.
Right, okay, thank you very much. That sounds very complex and challenging, so good luck with that. I will now pass on to Claire Baker, the Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener. The evidence so far has been quite interesting. The previous panel and the final comment said that this route was working quite smoothly, that it was different from the other routes. Could you maybe say a bit more about why that is? You described it as a domestic, it is a domestic crossing. Do you see its status changing, or is it because of the relationship between the Scotland and Northern Ireland trade route, and that's why it's operating differently from the others? Or do you think there would be is it looking like a more attractive route maybe to other exporters and importers?
So this is one of the interesting aspects that the next 6 to 12 months we will really build up a picture of whether there will be behavioural changes in business and in hauliers with regards to the use of this route, and much of that may be predicated on issues elsewhere. It was always something that we had factored in, and that could be something as significant as people avoiding the short straight crossings down in Dover and choosing to go through Ireland, and then coming up through Ireland and heading up towards Cairnryan, Larne and Belfast to come over, being one of them. Similarly, it might well be if there's issues at Holyhead, at the Dublin Holyhead crossing, again, that might mean that the Cairnryan crossings are a more attractive prospect for that as well. So there are a large number of variables in there, and really we just need to see how that pans out. Indications are that we are seeing a bit more EU traffic at this moment in time, but whether that's a short-term blip or whether that is more a long-term trend, I think only time will tell.
Mm-hmm. And how does that, you talked about qualifying and non-qualifying goods depending on where the point of origin is. How does that impact on what decisions might be made about using Cairnryan as a more popular route, becoming a more popular route?
Okay, so I don't necessarily think that'll impact on anybody's choice, apart from it may mean that some Northern Ireland traders or hauliers who would normally go to Dublin across to Holyhead may choose, as a result of unfettered access, may choose to come across at Cairnryan and then actually drive to their onward destination. So it may mean an increase in some hauliers of Northern Ireland origin may just continue or move to that route. For EU origin goods, it might be an attractive route whilst the border control post is not in operation and regulatory checks are not being undertaken. But once that is in place, that will be they will be treated the same way as they would at any other point of entry in the UK. So I don't think there would be a change either way.
And Mags, would you like to respond to these questions? And also, I think it was in your paper, there was one of the requests was around the trusted trading partners, which we had taken evidence earlier in this inquiry before we left the EU. It was an issue that was being talked about, whether there's been any progress on that kind of model.
Yeah, so can I maybe backtrack ever so slightly? I think it's really important that we're clear on what we're talking about here. So first of all, you've got the likely impact of the phased introduction of checks of imports from EU. So that's products coming from the EU into Britain, which we know is a phased introduction, and from January to April, where we are now, there's comparatively few things being checked unless it's tobacco or alcohol. And from April, in addition to that, the border checks will apply for some additional agri-food products, and then from July onwards, it's going to be full controls which apply to all goods. However, the Stranraer, or forgive me, I keep calling it Stranraer, I remember when the port was there, Cairnryan to Northern Ireland is very specific and is affected by the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, when we're talking about imports from Northern Ireland into Great Britain, the UK government does not want a border there. So right now, it's not entirely clear what checks are going to be put in place. It may be the case that none are put in place. I think we just need to be really careful about, what means what and what we understand as being the rules at the moment. And I think it's also important to point out that there's a clear differentiation between goods from the going to UK, because we know there will always be a full set of requirements on that. The EU have been quite clear. That's the set of rules. It's dictated by EU, and that's where all the SPS checks come in, etc., etc. So I think from that point of view, we need to be quite careful.
Sorry, Mag, sorry to interrupt, because it's been described as a, just so I'm clear in my own, so it's described as a domestic crossing, and you've talked about the goods that come from Northern Ireland come over to Scotland. But it is still goods coming from the EU can come all the way round and come over to that crossing.
Sorry, forgive me. And there's different elements of different products that have different rules, and that's where we need to be really careful, because, for example, when the grace periods end, we're going to have a real problem with, for example, parcels going over to Ireland because of the customs regulations that are going to start kicking in, and that's just a whole big nightmare. So that's a separate thing we need to look at. We've also got the issue that chilled meat, in theory, after July, will no longer be allowed to ship from Britain to Ireland because it's a third country going to Europe. So, there's all sorts of very specific elements, and I think previous witness is absolutely right. Until we get complete clarity on what it means for all these different elements of the goods, we don't know what the checks are going to be. So do we build an entire border post, which is obviously what's happening in Northern Ireland? Will that be necessary at Cairnryan? We don't know right now, which is probably why the funding hasn't been allocated. We know it has to happen at Holyhead, and I know from previous work I've done, there are concerns with Welsh Government that no work has started there yet, and yet in July we should be in a position where we're doing full checks. So it's that complication that means that, forgive me, I don't feel this is being terribly helpful, but there's so many different elements to this. It's so complex, and we need to really understand that Cairnryan is further complicated because it's part of that NI protocol. which the government is currently negotiating.
At the moment, it is helpful. And at the moment, it's fair to say that Cairnryan is operating quite smoothly. It has been with a few issues at the beginning, but it's quite smooth. But there's actually quite a lot of unknowns and still a lot to be decided in terms of how that port operates. That we'll find out at some point during this year.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
The other point you made about trusted traders. Forgive me, I'm just trying to find my notes.
Yeah.
Because that has moved forward, and it's moved forward in certain ways. So at the moment, the supermarkets essentially have become associated traders. The supermarkets and their trusted suppliers, and they have taken advantage. If you get onto that list, if you get onto the DEFRA list as one of these trusted traders, you are allowed to take advantage of the grace period. So the checks are not happening at the moment. But as I say, that is about to end, and that's one of our big asks at the moment. Is that of UK government is these grace periods have to be extended, because we have to come up with a long-term solution. Now, a lot of this is linked to groupage. I dare say you've heard about that before, but in particular groupage of a supermarket lorry, for want of a better phrase, who has lots of different types of food products on there, and all the rules are different. It's easy if you fill a truck with apples and move them all over, that's no problem. But as soon as you start mixing bananas in with those apples, or meat products in with those apples, it becomes incredibly complex. And each individual consignment has to be sealed before it can be moved. And because it's been sealed, that seal has to be checked when it crosses the border. So we very much, as an organisation, are pushing government to extend the grace periods, give us all a chance to work out what the long-term solution would be to some of these specific issues. And secondly, that the trust trader, that's it for supermarkets, but we need something similar for parcel delivery. We may need something similar for specific manufacturing. There's so many different elements of the economy that are going to be affected in so many different ways that we need time to figure out what the solutions could be. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you for the evidence. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I think, Mark Thompson, you wanted to come back in and answer to Claire's points.
Yes, I just wanted to firstly offer a point of clarification. My reference to domestic crossing was very much focused on the historical perspective, that prior to EU exit and prior to the end of the transition period, the crossing was domestic. But Mags is absolutely correct in pointing out that it's a very, very complex and almost unique position that the North Channel crossings now face in terms of different measures in place for checks going in various directions, and a blend of both UK traffic and EU traffic, which is quite unlike any other location in the UK in that regard as well. So it is a very complex position, but I would stress that we certainly don't view it purely as a domestic crossing now, and we can't in terms of the regulatory checks that will need to be taken going forward.
Sure. Okay, thanks very much for that clarification. I'll now bring in Dean Lockhart.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to Mags and Mark. Mark, you mentioned that DEFRA funding has been used elsewhere in the UK to help with some of these issues. I wonder if you could give us a bit more detail in terms of how that funding has been spent, and if there's an equivalent funding stream, to come in Scotland, how you would like that money to be spent, how it could be spent most effectively to help with any challenges you face.
Thank you. So the funding that I was being specific about was funding for Port Health authorities to actually put their new framework in place, and largely this has been associated with staffing and setup of the actual team, and that's really what we as a local authority are looking for. As I referred to earlier, we are starting from a point of zero in terms of we're not a Port Health Authority now, we don't have a Port Health Authority team, so we will have to recruit and pay for those staff in the short term until we get clarity on the income that we can receive from undertaking checks on goods that require to be checked. That means that there is going to be a very short-term start-up cost, both staffing, equipment, and infrastructure associated with that team, but also because of the complexity and the uncertainty with regards to the North Channel crossing and what level of checks will need to be undertaken going forward, there has to be a tail to that support funding. It's critically important that the council is not operating at a loss because of this need to create this team, and then we find the situation changes further down the line. So we would look for some sort of assurance that we will be supported until we reach a point of stability at some point further down the line from a financial perspective.
Yeah, that's very useful, Mark. Thanks for that. And have you heard anything from the Scottish Government or any agencies that equivalent funding might be in the pipeline? Is this something maybe the committee can help move along, or is it already kind of in progress?
Certainly, I've had a number of conversations with Scottish Government colleagues and some very productive conversations, and I think that we're moving in the right direction, but from a local authority perspective, I would rather have that absolute assurance at this moment in time. So any help that we get, either from SG officials or from the committee, would be more than welcome in that regard.
That's great. Mark, I'm sure we can follow that up. And Mags, you mentioned it in a previous answer that things in general are getting back to normal. You mentioned the stockpiling that happened before the end of the year, and obviously, COVID is an ongoing factor. Are you continuing to see progress? I mean, are things heading in the right direction? And I guess a similar question to Mark: how, what additional support would you like to see from both the Scottish Government and the UK Government to help with things?
Yeah, so if I can answer this in the way that we see the challenges that industry face, you can put them into three quite clear categories. First of all, you've got the educational, the understanding the process, which clearly involved an awful lot of parties. So not only the person wanting to move the goods, the person who actually physically moved the goods, and then the person who received the goods. There are so many moving parts that quite clearly was very tricky at the beginning. But we are finding, and I think it's important to point out again from that survey, the majority of issues was coming around about either initial misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the new rules, whether that was done on the part of the person moving the goods or the person selling the goods. So that seems to be getting better. Don't get me wrong, it's still a raft of paperwork. There's so many elements to it. The second area are specific systems elements. So that's systematically when different industries have tried to use these systems, so whether it's the customs systems or the TSS system for moving into Ireland, there are specific technical issues depending on which industry you're in that have been raised, and slowly but surely again these have been worked through. So in the beginning there was an awful lot of repetition on forms, and as I say, individual industries have picked these out and worked with DEFRA or the relevant authority to try and improve that. So slowly but surely that's getting better. Then the third element is the more complicated element perhaps, and that's the process element. And if I use the SPS groupage again as an example of that, so we initially did a lot of work, our members and ourselves worked with DEFRA and DERA to work on individual consignments being sealed on one vehicle. In the past, if you put a sealed load, you had to seal the vehicle down, but we've managed to come up with a process where you can put individually sealed loads on that truck. The truck can then be opened and the different loads checked. That's the beginning of that, a solution for that process element, but we need to further streamline that, and we need to make it more efficient. Because ultimately that's what logistics and transport is all about. It's about moving goods in the most efficient manner that's possible. And the more paperwork or the more barriers you put in place increases the time it takes to move whatever good it is you're moving and increases costs. So that's ultimately where we're moving to. Regards what support whether it's UK government or Scottish government can give. I've mentioned already, we've asked the UK government for an extension to the grace periods, but about specific on the ground issues, it's when that guidance is produced, what we found with our members is it tends to be list. What we want is operational specific guidance. Again, that will depend on what industry you work in, but the more we can make that operationally focused, the easier it is for an operator, whether it's someone selling a good or someone moving a good, can go into that guidance and read it. Unfortunately, at the beginning, partly because of the late timing of everything, it was reams and reams and reams of information that, I mean, nobody had a hope of trying to understand all that. So yeah, there's that element, and I suppose there's, if you talk about specifically Scottish government guidance, if at all possible, could it be that we fund some one-to-one support for those industries? So rather than just going to a website to try and understand the data, could it be that we could offer a telephone service, again sector specific, to give those businesses one-to-one to support to help them understand? A bit like Scottish Government have done before, I know, because they've focused on trying to get businesses to export more, and Scottish Enterprise have set up, support relationships. That would be the sort of thing that we would ask for.
Thanks very much, Mags. And just to one sort of follow-up question, you mentioned reams of paperwork, which is something we've heard from other evidence. To what extent are you seeing automation of that paperwork? Is it possible to some extent or to a large extent for that over a period of time to become an automated process and therefore less of a burden?
Yeah, the UK government again have published their future border strategy document. I believe that was published at the end of December, and that within that document there's talk about the development of a single trade window. So there would be a single gateway for electronic information to get to the relevant department and government. We clearly support that wholeheartedly, and that there's lots more detail within that. But we have pushed UK government to, rather than 2025, we need that in place by 2022. To streamline these systems. I won't bore you with the detail, but an exporter moving out to Europe, there's potentially 27 different systems that person has to work with. That just doesn't make sense. It needs to be, a one-way system for information. So, hand on heart, I can't tell you it's going to happen overnight, but over time, surely sense will be seen, and this will be made more straightforward.
Great. Well, to both Mags and Mark, thank you very much for your answers today. It sounds like, progress is being made, so best of luck going forward. Convener, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dean. And we now move to Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I've really only got one little thing perhaps to ask, because the answers so far have been quite comprehensive, and that is just whether there are any lessons to be learned from the very small ferry routes from Denmark to the Faroes, which operates about 70 times a year, and from Portugal to Madeira, which operates on more or less on a weekly basis. Very, very small compared to the link across the North Channel. But they are like this from one part of a state to another, one part being in the EU and one part being not in the EU. Are there lessons from how those routes actually operate and the administrative and practical processes around that can inform us of how things might be done in a more effective way between Northern Ireland and Scotland, which in effect, if not in law, one is in the EU and one is not, but they're part of a single state. Perhaps starting with Logistics UK.
Forgive me, I don't know the routes you're talking about, although my parents do love going to Madeira on holiday when they're allowed to. I suspect there's something along, forgive me for using this phrase, but not teaching a granny to suck eggs. The port operators in the industry that use this route know how to work it well, and to be fair, it is working well. there's also some reports of some traffic moving from Holyhead to Cairnryan, so that there is clearly Scottish Government want that route to become more viable. So yeah, work together, and all I would say is that industry work together with the operators, the ferry operators, etc., to improve facilities, perhaps. And let's not forget, it's not the only port in Scotland.
Indeed. Can I just pick up on, you said there's some traffic moving from Holyhead. Why are they doing that? Is it simpler for them to use Cairnryan administratively, or is it simply a commercial offer?
Dublin became quite congested. Dublin Port became quite congested, and I think there was a period of time that trying to get to Ireland through Dublin was a problem. So they've temporarily moved. I don't think it should be forgotten also that there is a lot of traffic now going on ferries direct from Dublin to Europe. They're completely avoiding the land bridge because and if your product suits that, great. The big thing about Dover Straits is just-in-time delivery, which is why the fish industry use it. But if your product is longer shelf life or whatever, you can move it from Ireland on a longer crossing direct to Europe, and we've seen a huge uplift in that route being used.
Yes, I believe there's a new ferry route from Cork to Boulogne-sur-Mer has either just started or is just about to start, and that's one of what I understand are 4 routes from Ireland direct to various ports in Europe. So, of course, unfortunately, the Scotland Act prohibits the Scottish Government from providing any financial support to international ferry routes. So we have to rely on a commercial case being made. But let me then, in alternative, turn to the Council and just ask whether there are lessons that can be learned from elsewhere that would be of any value. The 2 examples I give are of a much smaller scale than, of course, the operation between Cairnryan and Northern Ireland. So the answer may be no, but just to see if that's the case.
I think it's fair to say that there are undoubtedly many lessons to be learned from locations right across the UK and further afield, and it's something that we're actively doing. And something that colleagues in Scottish Government who are leading on the development and implementation of the actual physical border control post are leading on as well. So processes and the nature of the infrastructure, these are all key things that we can learn from people who have been doing it. And there's no point in trying to reinvent the wheel in so many of these occasions. So no, absolutely, I think it's a fair point. As is Mag's point, I think, particularly with regards to the ferry operators, both P&O and Stena are significant international operations with broad experience of ferry operations in many different settings, and I think they will be well placed. But with specific consideration to the regulatory aspects, I think absolutely, and we are actively trying to look at practice elsewhere to make sure that whatever model we arrive at locally is one that's fit for purpose and sustainable.
There's probably also the ferries across to the Channel Islands, which are already in the UK and outside the UK. Convener, I think that's all I want to ask at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Stevenson. We now move to Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. Quite a lot of what I'm interested in has already been covered, but it'd be useful to have your thoughts on the debate that's raging in Northern Ireland at the moment around altering the current arrangements to a Swiss-style arrangement, the Swiss SPS arrangement, so that essentially alignment on agri-health, etc., to avoid the need for sanitary and phytosanitary checks. The debate in Northern Ireland on that has people taking a range of what are basically incredibly similar positions of either the UK should approach the EU now to make a permanent arrangement on this, separate from any wider renegotiation of the protocol. Some people are advocating that we should approach them for a time-limited Swiss-style arrangement until a wider renegotiation.
Ross, I think we've lost Ross there.
the sanitary and phytosanitary checks or removing them?
Ross, you cut out completely there. Certainly for me, you cut out. So I don't know whether you repeat your question there.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now. Do interrupt me again if not. It was just about the situation in Northern Ireland, that there's quite a fierce debate taking place between people who seem to have strikingly similar positions within the executive but are disagreeing strongly about the potential for a Swiss-style deal on sanitary and phytosanitary checks, essentially removing the need for those in the way that there is with Switzerland. The positions are roughly that the UK should immediately ask for that to be brought in now on a permanent basis, that it should only be brought in, it should only be requested on a temporary basis until a wider renegotiation of the protocol and other arrangements is agreed. And the third position is that the UK should not seek a Swiss-style SPS arrangement yet, and that should only come into force as part of a wider negotiation of the protocol at some point in the future if that happens. So I'd be interested, I think this is maybe more for Mags, on your thoughts around what impact an SPS, a Swiss equivalent SPS arrangement for Northern Ireland would have, and which of those options is the most sensible one for the UK government to be pursuing immediately.
First and foremost, I'll make the point that I don't do our work in Ireland. My colleague Seamus Leahy, who was initially invited to come to this committee, does. He would give you a much better answer on this. And to be fair, if you write it to me, I'll get it to him. He's actually off this week. But I think there's a couple of things to mention that relate to this point. And number one is that the grace periods are about to stop. And as I think I alluded to earlier, one element of that ultimately means that chilled meat cannot, in theory, be moved from Great Britain into Northern Ireland after the 1st of July. Now, clearly that's not a situation that anybody wants to see. The other big area where there's going to be an issue is parcels and customs. So all parcels going across to Ireland, and clearly there's a great deal of them. The other element is around about 65% of goods from Great Britain go to Northern Ireland as retail products. So that's basically, you talk about your supermarket shelves not being filled. So from that point of view, all of this is going to kick in July. So something has to happen sooner rather than later. Forgive me, I don't know whether the Swiss-style deal is the correct one. Seamus would give you a much better steer on that, but something has to be done sooner rather than later. Otherwise, goods are not going to get to Ireland in its most basic format. And that's not about scaremongering, it's simply about fact that the goods need to keep moving.
Thanks very much. Yeah, happy. I'm sure we can speak to the clerks about sending that over in writing. Yeah. I don't know if Mark's got any thoughts on this. I know it's quite a specific and political point. It might not be something that the Council have considered.
Yeah, I was certainly going to offer up that it's probably not appropriate for a local authority officer to make a comment or express a preference at this moment in time, apart from it is really for the relevant competent authorities to make representations on that, which are our national organisations within Scotland and obviously as part of the wider UK. But notwithstanding that, whatever we arrive at, I think it's about arriving to it as quickly as possible so that we've got some stability and clarity so that we can ensure that there is appropriate movement of goods back and forth.
Thank you. That's all from me, Convener.
Thanks very much, Ross. Kenneth next.
Yes, thank you very much. Mark earlier on talked about the need for stability in terms of funding, and I think it's important, obviously, that Dumfries and Galloway Council do receive 100% of the funding required. But how much are we really talking about, and should it come? Dean Lockhart was suggesting, the Scottish Government, but obviously Brexit's a UK imposition, so one would hope it would come from that route. But how much do you believe that the Council will need once stability has been achieved? Because obviously what we don't want is a situation whereby you get a wee enough funding for a short term and then in the long term the Council loses out.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So it's a bit of an intangible at this moment in time, but our estimates in terms of if we're kind of going for a broadly equivalent size of team to other ports with the kind of movement of goods similar to ourselves, you could be talking 1.8 to £2 million in staffing costs per annum, which is significant. That's a significant amount of money, and that doesn't necessarily include any of the equipment-related costs, software-related costs, because there are obviously new software systems that we would need to invest in as well. So substantial costs in year one. Hopefully year 2, 3, 4, 5, we would be looking at as much cost recovery as possible through the imposition of fees for paperwork checks and for any of the physical checks we need to undertake. But because of the ongoing uncertainty about qualifying and non-qualifying goods and the volumes of such, this is where the challenge lies, because we don't really know how much income we will be able to generate at this time to actually offset the costs of the team. So, and this is why we have a concern not just about year one costs, but certainly for the first few years of establishment, we need to make sure that there is a safety net in place.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's important. Obviously, up front, you've got the infrastructure costs as well. And I don't think anyone feels that Dumfries and Galloway should be bearing the brunt of this in any way whatsoever. Max, looking at your short but excellent report, I noticed that 48.4% of your members talked about having postponements or cancellations since Brexit was imposed, and you said there's been a reduction in trade volumes, and a large majority have experienced issues with customs, sanitary and phytosanitary and safety and security declarations. And what you're saying is that a number are basically saying that a significant proportion do not expect to return to these levels, with some citing use of alternative routes, relocation or changing suppliers, which is obviously of real concern. Do you have any? Well, first of all, before I ask anything, I was going. Sorry, I'm trying to ask two things in my head at the same time. What the UK government has basically said is that the customs situation is really much better than, for example, the Road Haulage Association said. They said that they don't recognise the claim made by the Road Haulage Association that 50,000 extra customs agents would be required, and they didn't really touch on in their submission the claim by the Road Haulage Association that many of their customs officials have been recruited, semi-trained and experienced, trying to cope with massive volumes of e-paperwork, where one mistake in a consignment can stop a whole load. But in your report, you said that 88% of those who have had lower volumes or postponement in operations were due to customs issues. So quite clearly customs is a major issue. So how can we actually resolve that matter? I mean, if we've got a situation whereby we're hearing from hauliers, for example, that I believe are 44% of your members, that there's a real issue about customs, and the UK government seems to think actually the situation is more or less been resolved, and indeed they're even saying that there's an excess in capacity to some extent. So I wonder if you can talk us through that.
I can't give you a definitive answer on it, because we need to ask a specific question to our membership to get to the bottom of it. I think there is a lot of complication around what people mean by customs agents. Some people will interpret it as one thing, others will interpret it as others. There's obviously so many different parts of the customs processes that certain companies will have issues with one part, where another company will have an issue with a different part. So forgive me for not dodging the question, but it's so difficult to get a definite number on this. There is also reports from, we have representation in Europe, and we've heard that some European customs agents perhaps have refused to do work for, say, a British company because the terms and conditions of employment aren't correct. So whereas that could be reported as there is not availability of customs agents, in reality there are agents available. It's just that company was not successful in signing up them to do the work. Going back a few steps, I think it's important to recognise that clearly we talk about it in the industry that we haven't had customs agents for a generation, because obviously the European Union agreement was put in place and everything was straightforward. So it's been, what, 25, 30, 35 years since we've had a requirement for customs agents moving into Europe. That's simply, you know, it's a matter of fact that we need customs agents now to do that. But again, it's very difficult to put a precise number on that. So I believe it's a question we are asking our members going forward, so we hope to have more clarity on it, but forgive me, I can't give you a black and white answer on that one.
Yeah, I mean, really, the issue about customs is obviously how it impacts on your members and how, of course, it affects the Scottish economy, jobs, and the ability and indeed willingness of companies to export in the future, which is something I pursued with the previous panel. I mean, what you've also said in your submission is even though everybody knew how to apply the new rules properly, they're incompatible with their activities business model, indicating that substantial changes in processes are required across the business or their usual business is not facilitated by the trade and cooperation agreement. How do we address that? I mean, we've clearly got a situation whereby people want to export, they want to do business. The structures that have been put in place are not compatible with that, as you've clearly said. How can we change it? So, how can we change that to try and ensure that we smooth things over?
This again is incredibly difficult. Logistics UK represents so many different types of business, but if I can perhaps use a current example to demonstrate, because what we've found is that as Brexit's happened, slowly but surely different industries and different businesses have been affected. So first and foremost, it was the fish industry, because they're all about just-in-time deliveries. It's now become apparent that farmers and the meat industry is going to be affected. Another industry that we've, and I suppose this is quite relevant talking to this committee, is the touring industry. Now, touring is a very specific British industry that have very specific types of vehicles that either move tours of music acts around the country, to move Formula One racing teams around Europe, or London Philharmonic Orchestra, or indeed the Glasgow Philharmonic Orchestra, Scottish Orchestra. It's a really specific type of business that have completely, because of the new rules that have come in, basically cannot operate. And that's because of two things: visas and the cabotage rules. They're only allowed to make two movements in Europe when they get there. So their business model just doesn't work anymore. And they as an industry are having to go away and obviously are lobbying UK government and trying to get some common ground. The issue we've got is that, and we've talked about the fish industry in the past, that their business model of getting product just in time within a 24-hour window from A to B into Europe is incredibly tight already. As soon as you start putting extra checks in place, it becomes more difficult to do it. So, as I say, each industry is trying to get their head around how these rules work. And unfortunately, there is no magic wand that makes it work for everybody. So each individual industry are having to consider how they operate with Europe and what they're going to do going forward. So it's a real, yeah, I feel I'm being terribly negative. I'm trying not to be. Businesses will work out how to do it, but I don't think government can suddenly say, well, do that, it's going to fix everything for everybody. It's not. That what we need to do is simplify the red tape as much as we can, make IT systems talk to each other, give as much guidance as we can to each individual sector to try and help them make sense of it. Does that answer at all?
No, well, I mean, it's almost an impossible question to answer, so I do appreciate your efforts in that regard. But what you've actually said, I have actually, made some positive suggestions. You've talked about, obviously, the need to simplify UK red tape, boosting uptake of trusted trader. You also talk about bringing forward delivery of the 2025 border strategy. So I'm wondering how that will make a difference in terms of, what we've talked about, encouraging more people to trade, make it easier for those who are currently trading.
Ultimately, it's about simplification of the process. One element is they talk about the development of a single trade window, which creates a single gateway for all data from traders into government. So customs, for example, it all goes via one route, whereas at the moment you've got several different websites potentially where information has to go in. Another example would be electronic travel authorization, which is more about speeding up journeys through ports. Again, if you can do that for goods and make it really have a complete review of the agencies and checks that occur at a border and rationalise them wherever we can, it makes that movement going through the port. At the moment, going to a port to get checks done is a big barrier, because number one, nobody understands it properly, or the people moving the goods don't understand it properly. Number two, everybody's trying to learn what should be checked, what shouldn't be checked, and ultimately delays are created. Now, if the delay gets big enough, you're not going to go anywhere near that port because you can't guarantee your goods being delivered to the customer. So until, it's about simplification of process and helping businesses navigate that process in order to continue to do their product, do their service, their job efficiently.
Yeah, and I mean, I should have said, obviously, that the committee also took evidence from the Musicians' Union, which concurred with a lot of what you said earlier. Just one final question, if I may, Convener. Again, in your submission, I'm going to be asking Mark for a response on this as well. You've said that we need to relaunch a business communication strategy, or the UK government does, in advance of the introduction of full border checks on imports from the EU from 1st of July. So we've obviously got issues at the moment. They've got further hurdles on the 1st of April, and then we've got others in July. So I'm just wondering what issues and concerns you have about the 1st of July, and I'll be asking the same question to Mark.
There's all sorts of elements to it again, but if I can try and encapsulate it in one statement, it's clearly we are one country exporting out to 27. It's going to be coming from the other direction, so it's 27 different countries, 27 different interpretations of the rules. It should only be one, clearly, because it's Europe, but there's going to be friction there. Another issue that we've picked up on is that, again, it's been picked up at this end, that the number of vets being available is a problem. That's an even bigger problem in Europe, because clearly it's a much bigger area. So there's all sorts of different elements, again, that, forgive me if I feel like I keep saying that, but it's so complicated, this issue, that, again, we need to make sure that everybody understands what they're doing, and the customers receiving goods in this country need to be talking to the importers and making sure that there's a two-way communication. So we need to encourage businesses in Britain and Scotland who are receiving goods from Europe, talk to your suppliers, make sure they know, and make sure you're sharing the information to try and streamline that as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to go back and touch upon the point Mags made about the UK border strategy as well, and absolutely agree. Simplification of what is quite a disparate number of different processes, agencies, systems at this moment in time will be hugely important. It doesn't take away from the fact that certain types of customs and regulatory checks will still need to happen, but the overarching framework could be far more streamlined, so we would welcome that. I think all agencies involved would welcome that going forward. But to go back to your other point, there's two aspects to it. I think one is readiness, and that's readiness in terms of businesses, systems, infrastructure, and staffing. There's a very, very complex system, and there are a whole host of things that would need to be in place and ready to go when this date actually takes place. And then the other aspect of that really is clarity, both in terms of competent authorities, stakeholders, businesses and their customers, so that there is absolute certainty and understanding of what is required going forward as well. So you're absolutely right. The communication strategy associated with it is going to be particularly significant, and I think whilst UK government have got a significant role to play in that, I think all agencies in the public sector will have a role to play in actually promulgating that through the various sectors.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mags, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to the panelists. Can I first ask this question of Mark? It goes back to the Port Health Authority status. You said 1.8 to 2 million, I think, for the first year of operations. But are you including that as kind of setup costs? Because obviously some of that will be staffing that will be ongoing. But you didn't include things like IT and perhaps some program software, that kind of thing. So could you kind of give us an estimate of, firstly, the setup costs, and also when you would hope to have income coming in from those using the port, when that would start to happen?
Okay, so two aspects to that. Obviously, in terms terms of the physical infrastructure and the border control post, the border control post will be constructed by Scottish Government themselves. So it will be a Scottish Government facility, at least in the initial period, and it will be a facility used not only by the local authority but also by colleagues from AFA, for animal related matters, and Food Standards Scotland as well. So there'll be a range of agencies operating from there. And we're not really factoring that in because those costs will really be addressed by Scottish Government through the existing project team that's looking at that. But in addition to that, from ourselves, staffing is absolutely, and that was really the cost that I relayed, but we do have to factor in systems and software related costs and IT infrastructure associated with that as well, which you could be looking at a low six-figure sum to actually make that happen in terms of the initial costs. And then it's also just some of the kind of more simplistic things. The type of role that they're taking means that there'll be significant, for that whole team, there'll be significant physical equipment, PPE related costs, the equipment they need to do to undertake the checks as well. So again, that could be a not insignificant initial money, and then there will be ongoing operational costs. But in terms of us actually generating income, as soon as we actually start undertaking checks, we will be generating income, because there'll be a fee associated with every check that's undertaken, whether that be paperwork related checks or indeed more onerous physical checks as well. So there will be, but the challenge that we do have is we're not wholly clear, because there is no clarity between qualifying and non-qualifying goods at this moment in time, exactly how many checks we will be needing to undertake.
Okay, so no, I understand that. So you're not sure exactly how much is going to be coming in. Can I ask though? I mean, if you're able to say, how much are you looking from or asking the Scottish Government for at the moment? Have you got a figure that you're able to give us?
At this stage, I think it's to be prepared for an ask of between £2 and £2.5 million. I think, and would be fair. But we would obviously need to work through that detail once we get a better idea of what we're expecting coming through the ports, and we know what the framework is going to be.
Okay, so that may go up or down depending on as things become a little bit more, as you say, clearer. Clarity is a big issue for all of this, and a word that has been very much used on all these. Okay, can I then ask?
And that would be year. Sorry, I was just going to say that would be year one, and I obviously referred to earlier that there might be additional costs in the years beyond that as well.
Okay, can I ask then? I mean, when did discussions start with the Scottish Government on this? Because obviously there has been, it's not this wasn't the kind of information that was just available at the beginning of this year or when the deal was signed. There was always concerns that this sort of thing may happen. So when did discussions happen, and kind of how confident are you that they will deliver?
Okay, so well, specific conversations on this happened kind of just in advance of the end of the transition period, but I'm obviously well aware that within the Scottish Government at an officials level, there was significant discussions ongoing, but entirely understandable given that the negotiation period between UK Government and EU ran right up until just immediately before Christmas. There was no clarity and no certainty on what the outcomes would be, and then what the onward implications would be for points of entry, and then particularly in the Cairn Ryan and the North Channel crossing as well. So I think I'm relatively comfortable in saying that Scottish Government involved and engaged with the local authority at the appropriate time once they had some certainty about the way forward. With regards to the comfort in terms of Scottish Government officers delivering, I do have to highlight that there is a wider stakeholder group involved in some of the discussions and scoping work. Scottish Government officers have been very quick to recognise that it's not just something that can be done on their own, and a range of industry partners and local authority and a range of other organisations are all involved in some of those discussions. I do think it's challenging. Again, referring to the lack of clarity, it is going to be difficult, as it is difficult right across the UK for port health authorities and agencies to meet the timescales that have been set I wouldn't be surprised at some slippage across the UK in these matters.
Okay, thank you for that. Just the last kind of question to you, Mark. Unless, of course, the answer gives me another question. But just in terms of that, the UK government, the Scottish government have been provided with £200 million for Brexit preparedness. If the Scottish government don't meet your ask, either in full or with a substantial amount, who pays? Who will have to end up paying for this?
Well, I think it's a consideration that we're having at a local authority level as well, and we're actually looking. Our legal services are actually looking at it. It's perhaps not so much about who pays; it's about what level of service can we provide. Whilst we might have statutory obligations to undertake these checks as a Port Health Authority, if we don't actually have the necessary funding. And as such, as a knock-on of that, the necessary staffing cohort to undertake that checks, it puts us into a challenging position. So really, I think that's the more important question would be, it's not so much about who pays and what happens if they don't pay. It's about if the funding isn't available to us, how can we undertake this activity? And I think that's really where we would be coming from. We want to be able to do it. We want to make it a successful and smooth operation, because we absolutely want to encourage economic activity and the movement of goods, but we need to have the support to actually be able to deliver on that.
And that would have big implications going forward, I imagine. Okay. Thank you for that. I was just going to ask very quickly, Mags, a question. Your organisation, Logistics UK, doesn't just cover road transport, and it covers other types of transport as well, freight as well. I was just wondering if there'd been any uptake or any increase in air freight at all from Scotland. When there was a ban on air travel, almost a complete ban on air travel, there were the only planes that seemed to be in the sky were freight planes or post planes and things like that. So just wondering if there's been any uptake in that, and whether that is something that you might see increasing.
So a few things to make you aware of. 95% of air freight moves in the belly hold of passenger planes. So clearly with them being grounded, some of the air freight that you've seen moving is some of those passenger carriers trying to keep some planes moving. So they offered the possibility, I don't know if you saw, I think it was Amazon, they had the parcels strapped into the seats like passengers. It was quite bizarre. But it was to try and keep the planes moving around the country, the world, I should say. And air freight is incredibly expensive. As part of the Food Resilience Group, we tried to look at moving fish by plane. At one point, it was 10 times more expensive than moving it by road. To be fair, the Scottish Government did do some work, and Transport Scotland we did some work. They got it down to about 4 times the cost. But it's prohibitively expensive unless your goods are. It tends to be electronic parts that move by air.
Okay, thanks very much. It was just, as you say, I appreciate there was a huge role for the passenger airlines, but it just seemed to be unusual that you were seeing planes coming in. For those of us that can be slightly geeky and use things like Flight Radar, and you see planes coming in and out, and they're always freight.
A lot of PPE, I believe, was moved by plane for the COVID crisis, so that's probably what was being moved.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you to Mags and Mark for those questions and answers.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of just little extra questions I wanted to put to you. First, Mark, you talked about the way that you might be able to recoup some money through the processing charges at the Port Health Authority. Have you made any calculations around how much you might recoup that way? And I would imagine you have to take into balance keeping the port competitive if you are competing with other ports, and is that something that you've had to take into your calculations?
Yes, not myself directly, but my colleagues in the environmental health team and the manager responsible have been looking at that. So again, it goes back to getting some clarity on what goods we will be coming through that will be eligible for checks, and that's where there is this area of uncertainty. But whatever staffing level is arrived at really has to be balanced with the number of checks wherever possible. That's how it operates in other ports right across the UK, and that's what we would try to achieve. Your point's well made with regards to the actual fees that will be allocated. Some, as my understanding is, some fees are set through a statutory instrument, so there's no variation, but other ones it will be the choice of the local authority, and we will obviously have to make sure that the fees are competitive, because it's important to encourage that movement of goods through there. That's obviously very, very important for Dumfries and Galloway as well. So yes, the picture will become clearer hopefully in the coming weeks, but yeah, there's some key pieces of information about the movement of goods and the movement of EU goods or non-qualifying goods in particular that we need to bottom out.
Yeah, because when you're looking at it that way, you're running a business, aren't you? And you're running a business competing against ports that have been operating that business for many years. So that's quite a challenge for you.
As I just go back to the point, and colleagues in Scottish Government do recognise this. The North Channel crossing in Cairnryan, it is a bit of a unique situation because of our starting point, so we're going to have to get up to speed, but we will have the support of the wider kind of peer community, and we've had many offers of support from ports elsewhere, and colleagues in Food Standards Scotland. So we're in a good place, but it's going to be a challenging couple of years. As really for that team, the Port Health Authority team, it will be a quick learning process. But we're ever hopeful that we'll make a success of it, because it is important for the region generally.
Yes, absolutely, and wish you luck with that. Thank you very much. And with Mags, you mentioned several times the complexity when it came to coming to the regulations that will kick in after April and July. You mentioned the whole issue around chilled meats, which we had talked about before in the committee, but you also talked about parcels, and I wondered if you could maybe elaborate on that for anyone listening, the implications for parcels.
Yep, sure. Forgive me, I'm just finding my notes on this. So, parcel delivery service from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. What we've asked UK government for is that we need a trusted trader scheme to enable authorised parcel operators to use truck level safety and security declarations. At the moment, it's consignment level, which means individual parcels. So if you can imagine, there's up to, I don't know, 2,000 parcels on one lorry, you would have 2,000 bits of paper in order to make that a legal crossing. And we believe that using the authorised economic operator scheme, we could, there could be an adaptation to that used for that purpose to make it mutually recognised between EU and UK. So it's a big challenge. It's coming down the line. It's something that we've been speaking to government for some time now, because you clearly can't. This post can't stop going between Northern Ireland and Britain. It needs to be sorted out.
And have you got any sense that they will come to some kind of agreement?
I can't speak on behalf of the government, but they're going to have to do something.
Okay, thanks very much. And my final question is to repeat a question that Christian Graham put to our previous panel. What have the benefits of Brexit been so far?
Are you asking me that?
Yes.
Gosh, I need to think carefully before I answer that one. It's difficult. It's difficult. Forgive me, my brain's gone blank. It's a real challenge. The industry is working around the solutions. Industry is understanding the process and coming up with solutions, and goods are still moving. But yeah, it's could we say there's an individual benefit to Brexit? Probably not.
Mark, from your point of view, have you seen any benefits in Dumfries and Galloway so far?
Okay, well, I would maybe look at, and I'll answer it slightly differently rather than answering that directly. I think as a council, we recognise the numerous challenges that EU exit has brought, and we will always look to mitigate those. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognise and try and move forward with whatever economic opportunities, job creation opportunities, infrastructure investment will come from this. And I think the creation of a border control post going forward will bring valuable professional quality jobs to the Wigtonshire area. I know, Convener, you know the area so well out there as well. So there will be, going forward, there will be benefits there as well. And obviously, we're in conjunction with South of Scotland Enterprise and ferry operators and other partners, we will be looking to take forward a Greenport bid going forward as well to try and maximise and further enhance economic opportunity. But yes, a lot of challenges we've had to work in the past year, and going forward this year we do have a number of challenges to deal with.
Thank you very much. Christine Graham has pressed her button. I think Christine wants in with a question.
Just a supplementary to what you asked, Convener. Creating border control posts, and in the previous session, more vets and more these are all administrative, caused by Brexit. What are the advantages of Brexit to the economy, wider economy, rather than just, these are really in a way costs rather than benefits? So can we hear from you? Please say the councillor has been a wee bit more sort of circumspect. But the other panellist doesn't have to be. No wonder you took a long time to answer that question. Don't blame you. So could you tell me, I've sat through so many of these sessions and I've not, everything's mitigation. So could you just develop it a bit?
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult question to answer, Convener, and I think as an industry we have been so focused in the last 2 months, and bearing in mind the impact of COVID as well, trying to work through this to keep the goods moving. As I said earlier on in my evidence, it's different parts of the economy have been working through solutions to this, and we've been doing our best to support everybody and try and come up with the answers. I suppose it's going to be difficult for Europe as well, continuing to do business with us, and the end of this grace period is going to start seeing those impacts, and as a country we need to work better with Europe. I suppose I could refer back to the touring issue. We need to come up with a solution for that, because it's a mutually benefit, it's a mutual benefit to both parties. So we're doing what we can. Benefits to wider economy, we need to wait and see, I suspect. An industry, I have to say, has been working very closely with lots of different parties to try and come up with the solutions. So that has to be a good thing, that industry is working better together to come up with mutually beneficial solutions.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any more supplementaries in the box from our members, so it just remains for me to say thank you very much to both our panellists, Mr Thompson and Ms Simpson, for attending and for their evidence today. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. I will allow a couple of minutes for members to have a comfort break and to move to Microsoft Teams before we resume in private session. Thank you very much and goodbye.